the Admiral of Hogwarts. Welcome back, brave explorers of impossible worlds. We are excited to have you here to continue this odyssey together. Before we continue, everything you'll hear is pure fiction, so please don't try to replicate combat techniques at home. This wonderful story and all its rights belong to its brilliant original author. We are only the messengers of entertainment. Want another dose of adventure? Subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss a single chapter, and if you can't wait, our Patreon has exclusive surprises you'll love. Chapter 176 Home. In his report, the Soviet Union quickly introduced Hugo to the things he had been doing recently. After listening to these introductions, Hugo realized that compared to the conflicts the Soviet Union faced, the problems others faced were just minor squabbles after all. Whether in the United States or the United Kingdom, the ship girls, hoping to infiltrate secretly, only had small-scale street conflicts with some local forces, but what the Soviet Union was facing now was a real, large-scale, modern war. However, just as the Soviet Union said, on such land battlefields, when facing ordinary enemies, the ship girls could fully utilize their advantages. To give a simple example, when facing an attack from a fully armed enemy armored regiment, the Soviet Union and Stalingrad only fired 3 rounds of main gun salvos and destroyed half of the enemy's strength. Then, from the front, together with 2 regiments of subordinates, they completely defeated the 2 divisions directly opposite them, whose morale had basically collapsed in the shelling from this incident. Hugo once again accurately recognized that ship girls are essentially a very terrifying weapon system. Think about it, each of them can be a seemingly weak and harmless girl 1 second, and the next second, they can pour out the entire firepower of a warship at the target for those armed forces who are hostile to them. If a battleship girl like the Soviet Union uses the 12 152mm secondary guns on her body to attack, it is no less powerful than a heavy artillery cluster, and the 406mm main guns are completely in existence beyond the standard for most armies. Not to mention that for those ship girls, they can completely fire their artillery shells with a terrifying precision of guided missiles. For example, according to the Soviet Union, during her attack on a large fortress built during the Cold War, guarded by 500 or 600 armed militants, she simply fired the 152mm secondary gun shells into the fortress's firing ports and entrances. They then successfully took down the large fortification, which was previously expected to require thousands of casualties to obtain. Therefore, the Soviet Union and the others planned to seize the most important coastline in the western part of the Balkan Peninsula this winter, and take the opportunity to block the enemy's possibility of obtaining supplies through the coastline. By the way, they would use this time to gather enough supplies and reorganize their forces, and then launch a large-scale attack when spring blossoms. According to declassified materials from later generations, the reasons for the outbreak of this long war in the Balkans in history were very complicated. Therefore, due to various considerations, the ship girls limited the scope of their desired control to the western part of this chaotic region, rather than the entire region. After all, compared to the dense population in the east and various complex situations, the west, with its sparse population and simpler situation, is more in line with the needs of those ship girls. You need to know that the reason why the ship girls participated in this war is very simple, that is, to control the home port of Paran. As for the reasons for a series of subsequent actions, they are all due to the kindness in the ship girls' hearts. However, kindness is kindness, and the ship girls, as natural warriors, do not have any saintly personalities. So their plan is naturally the most suitable plan for the current stage. After repeated deliberation, after listening to all the reports from the ship girls, Hugo, who had been tensing his nerves, relaxed all of a sudden and fell asleep. Okay, we're here, stop sleeping. Feeling someone shaking him, Hugo quickly woke up. It turned out that his sister Hermione was shaking his arm. Ah, have we arrived already? Hugo said, looking out the window, and found that it was snowing heavily. It seemed that Norway, which was further north than England, had more snow. This is much more convenient than our last trip to America, because of a series of agreements in the Western European magical world, so as British people, we don't need to register our wands after passing through customs. While following his parents out of the arrival hall, Hermione whispered to Hugo, then how do they manage their borders? Hugo seemed a little curious, although he had learned from reading some books beforehand that the ministries of magic in the Nordic countries had streamlined procedures in many places compared to Western Europe due to their smaller populations. He was not clear about the specific process. It's very simple. Look at the totem poles placed next to those customs stations, Hermione said, pointing to the wooden totem poles placed next to each customs inquiry counter like decorations. These totem poles are actually some magical detection tools. When wizards pass through these totem poles, they will automatically register. It is indeed a very clever method. Hugo nodded after looking at these totem poles. It has to be said that this is a very clever approach, because people who want to cross the border illegally naturally have various ways to avoid those border inspectors, and when facing those wizards who legally enter the country through Muggle channels, these totem poles that can automatically register can obviously balance the three needs of humanization, automation, and efficiency. After everyone left the arrival hall, the snow fell even harder. Fortunately, Mr. Granger had asked his father-in-law to make a phone reservation for a car rental before coming, so after picking up the keys at the airport service desk, they immediately drove into the snowstorm in an off-road vehicle. Soon after getting on the road, Mr. Granger accelerated. Because there was temporarily not much snow on the ground, and there were not many people on the streets soon, this red off-road vehicle sped through the wind and snow at a speed of over 80 kilometers per hour, while passing clean and tidy streets and houses with brightly colored walls and pointed roofs. After about half an hour, the car turned a crossroads and then stopped on a small road with shrubs on both sides. On the side of this road, which could only accommodate 3 cars side by side at most, 2-story detached buildings with gardens were neatly arranged on both sides of the road. After getting out of the car, Hugo found that although there was still some time before Christmas, the Christmas atmosphere on this street was already very strong. For example, he saw that each building here was decorated with some Christmas decorations above and in front, and bright lights also radiated from the windows of those rooms and the colored lights of the decorations. After taking out a notebook and checking the house number, they quickly came to one of the houses and knocked on the door. This house, like the other houses on the street, was built of gray and brown stones and bricks. There was a small garden in front of the house, separated from the pedestrian crossing by an iron fence. On the front wall of the house, some colored lights were hung in the shape of Christmas greetings. At the same time, in front of the house, there was also a Christmas tree more than 1 person tall, hanging with many beautiful decorations and colored lights. Mrs. Granger opened the door of the iron fence at this time and rang the doorbell in front of the house. Soon, the door opened. Warm light and bursts of food aroma poured out from the crack in the door, turning the snow in front of the door into gold. Chapter 177 Story. I thought you two, Zuda, would arrive a bit later. Hugo and Hermione's maternal grandfather, Carl, said to Mrs. Granger, "Come in quickly. Your mother and I have been busy all morning preparing this welcome dinner. It'll be ready in about an hour. I even made your favorite gingerbread cookies." After a quick cleanup, Mr. and Mrs. Granger immediately went to the kitchen to help. Hugo and Hermione rested on the sofa in front of the fireplace in the living room, with a box of pastries that Grandpa Carl had given them on the coffee table: cream cookies, gingerbread men, cream-filled cupcakes. "These are all my favorites. Hugo, want some?" Hermione exclaimed excitedly after opening the pastry box. After all, for a teenage girl, the temptation of sweets is very strong. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. Granger are both dentists, so they basically don't allow their children to eat any sweets. They even wrote separate letters to Hugo and Hermione after they went to Hogwarts, reminding them to eat as few sweets as possible at school. "Thanks," Wallace said, taking a gingerbread man from his sister and taking a bite. But just as they had eaten 2 or 3 pastries, Mr. Granger came out of the kitchen. "Looks like Dad got kicked out of the kitchen again," Hermione said, turning to look at Hugo, a smile on her face. Mr. Granger usually likes to help out in the kitchen when the family is cooking, but he always gets kicked out quickly because he ends up being more of a hindrance than a help. "Okay, you two can laugh if you want," Mr. Granger said, shaking his head helplessly at the 2 children who were trying to hold back their laughter. After the 2 kids finished laughing, he said to them, "All right, I think you're done laughing, right? Next, let's decorate this house together." Soon, Hugo and his father and grandfather got busy. When Hugo's mother and grandparents finished cooking dinner and came out of the kitchen, they had already hung up all the decorations that hadn't been put up yet. The Christmas decorations were actually just a few kinds: some small plastic or glass ornaments, some long strings of small colored lights, and some metallic colored paper. When everyone entered the living room, all the lights in the room were turned on. After all, it was winter here, and it was snowing. So even at noon, the room was still a bit dim. These colored lights, combined with the original lights in the room, illuminated the entire hall. Although you could see the heavy snow falling outside the window, the room seemed vibrant, and everyone sat around the dining table, eating and sharing their experiences. This lunch was very sumptuous. The 2 elders prepared a delicious meal from every angle to welcome their younger relatives, whether it was the golden brown roast chicken, the fragrant roast venison, or the honey-glazed shortbread. They were all Hugo's favorite things to eat, so, more than an hour later, everyone sat in the tea room next to the dining room with a satisfied expression, drinking hot cocoa and continuing the topic from the dining table. I never thought that legends like magic, wizards, and even dragons actually exist in this world, Hugo's maternal grandfather, Carl, said with a sigh after taking a sip of the hot cocoa in his hand. Then he leaned forward slightly and looked at Hugo and his sister. Listening to you, I think some of the legends from my hometown might be true. Earlier at the dining table, Mrs. Granger had told Hugo's grandparents that Hugo and his sister Hermione were wizards. After listening to Mrs. Granger's description, Carl immediately remembered some of the stories he had heard in his hometown as a child. As for why Hugo's grandparents didn't know they were wizards until now, the reason is simple. Because Hugo and his family had moved to Norway after receiving their letters from Hogwarts out of concern for others eavesdropping or stealing information, the Granger family did not notify the two elders of this information by phone or letter. Legends from your hometown, Grandpa. Isn't your hometown Oslo? Hugo asked, puzzled. He only vaguely knew that his grandfather's hometown was in Norway, but he didn't know exactly where. Therefore, he naturally regarded Oslo, where his grandfather now lived, as his hometown. Of course not. I live in Oslo now because I'm old and I've lived in England for too long, so I can't stand being in my hometown in the winter at all. After hearing Hugo say this, Carl shook his head gently and said, my hometown is in a fjord in the north, a small city with a population of less than 20,000, a city on an ice field. Sounds pretty cool, Hermione said softly. For a girl who grew up in the big city of London, this small city built in a fjord on the east coast of the North Atlantic is completely different from her hometown. So the whole person suddenly became excited. Cool? No, that word is too gentle to describe the temperature there. I think coldness is a more standard way to describe the temperature there. Grandpa Carl obviously misunderstood the meaning of the word. Hermione said, my hometown is Narvik in Nordland County, which is also the northernmost port city in the world, mainly for mineral transportation. Then Carl briefly introduced his hometown to everyone present. Although this city is not big, it can be regarded as the Pearl of the North near the Arctic Circle as the main export port of Swedish iron ore. But I think you people who grew up in England may have never heard of this remote small city. Grandpa, I've heard of this place. Hugo waved his hand to indicate. I remember that there should have been a large-scale naval battle in that place in the 40s. Yes, that's right. Back then, the German devils landed here in order to occupy Norway and obtain Swedish iron ore. My father was a member of the resistance organization at the time and stayed in the surrounding mountains for a long time, and it was at that time that he saw some strange and obviously abnormal things. According to the story he told me when I was a child, he once ran into a deep mountain that basically no one had ever been to in order to avoid a search of the Germans, and then saw a big guy. What was that big guy? Mrs. Granger asked with wide eyes. Obviously, Carl had never told his daughter the story before. My father doesn't know either. Carl shrugged helplessly. At that time, he saw 5 or 6 huge black shadows like small mountains slowly moving in the valley below the mountain, but unfortunately, he passed out directly afterwards. When he woke up, half an hour had passed, and he found himself lying in a cave, with a pile of bonfires burning next to him and several pieces of dry food placed there. But no matter how he recalled afterwards, he couldn't remember what he encountered in that half hour. Chapter 178: A New Call. This matter does indeed seem to involve magic. After his grandfather finished telling the story he heard as a child, Hugo and Hermione exchanged a glance, and then Hugo spoke. In our understanding, each country has its own magical governing body. In such cases, they would cast spells on non-magical people who see certain secrets, making them forget things they shouldn't have seen. So, I think my grandfather's father likely saw some magical creatures and was then subjected to memory charm by personnel from the Norwegian Ministry of Magic, Hermione added. It's just that the caster's skill seemed a bit lacking, which is why he could only remember a little bit. Such minor issues with memory charms are not uncommon, especially in countries like Norway, where the Ministry of Magic staff quality isn't as elite as in larger countries like Britain due to the small number of practitioners. However, for wizards, as long as there aren't any major errors overall, it's fine. After all, without evidence, these ordinary people's residual impressions will only add new content to urban legends. For example, the story Hugo's grandfather told is like that. If Hugo and Hermione hadn't become wizards and learned about these things, they would have treated it as a simple urban legend. This after-dinner conversation lasted late into the night, until all the firewood in the fireplace had burned away. and everyone perked up and went back to their rooms to do their own things for the rest of the day. Everyone focused mainly on chatting and planning the upcoming trip because according to their plans, the Granger family of 4 intended to spend a dozen or so days traveling around northern Norway before returning here to celebrate Christmas with their relatives. "Forget about a road trip," Mr. Granger said helplessly after looking through a travel guide. "The roads are all snow and ice. I haven't had professional training, so driving on these roads is very dangerous." "You're right. When a family comes out to play, it's natural to pay attention to safety." Mrs. Granger nodded in agreement. "Moreover, Oslo is considered the southernmost part of Norway, and the snow is already this heavy. The snowfall further north is likely to completely block the roads. If we drive there, we could easily get stuck on the road and not be able to return." At night, the wind mixed with snowflakes relentlessly pounded against the window panes. Fortunately, because today's travel had exhausted him, Hugo, who usually had trouble sleeping in new places, fell asleep as soon as his head hit the pillow in the morning. Hugo was awakened directly by the alarm clock. However, because it was winter, the sun had not yet risen, but after Hugo pulled back the thick curtains, he found that it wasn't as dark outside as he had imagined, because the wind and snow of the entire previous day had covered everything outside with a thick layer of snow. After breakfast, the Granger family said goodbye to their grandparents and then went to the city to begin their trip. Just as they reached the vicinity of the royal palace in the city center after a half-hour journey, the sun slowly rose from the horizon instantly. The sky was filled with a bright light of dawn, pure white and clear. And the thin mist that had been floating over the earth gradually dissipated under the illumination of the radiant red sun. "This is really too beautiful," the Granger family exclaimed almost simultaneously as they watched the sunlight dye everything in front of them gold. For them, who had always lived in London, the fresh air and bright sunshine in Oslo brought them some unexpected surprises. Although Mrs. Thatcher's approach of closing down a large number of industrial and mining enterprises in England at the cost of large-scale unemployment had successfully reversed London's original environment, but compared to here, the air quality in England, especially in London, was still somewhat lacking. That day, Hugo visited the Norwegian Royal Palace, Vigeland Sculpture Park, and Oslo City Hall. He also enjoyed the scenery of the fjord up close at the harbor. In the evening, Hugo and Kay entered the fjord together and summoned the shipgirls who had left their mark in this area. "It's a bit embarrassing to meet the commander at this time," a girl with pink hair said to Hugo after his summoning ended, giving him a salute beside her. Another girl in military uniform with long golden hair also gave a wry smile after hearing this. I'm really sorry, but this place does indeed bear your mark." Looking at the 2 shipgirls in front of him, Hugo had an embarrassed expression on his face. For Blücher and Deutschland, the battle they fought to attack Oslo back then could definitely be considered a tragedy during the Norwegian campaign. Their mission was to land in Oslo, but when they entered the fjord, Deutschland was damaged by shore batteries, and Blücher was directly sunk here by those old-fashioned shore batteries that were also produced in Germany. "It's okay. Failure is failure, and there's nothing embarrassing about admitting failure." The 2 German shipgirls seemed a bit flustered after seeing Hugo apologize. "By the way, Commander, what is our next job?" To escape from this awkward situation, Deutschland immediately asked Hugo about the next step in the plan. "What are your current identities?" After hearing Deutschland's question, Hugo immediately inquired about the shipgirls' current identities. "Our current identities are all German wild wizards who have only received master-disciple inheritance. The reason for coming to Norway is to purchase some magical materials unique to the cold regions," Deutschland said to Hugo after quickly recalling. "If that's the case, then you can temporarily find a place to settle down here." After Deutschland finished speaking, Hugo first discussed it with the shipgirls through the Admiral network. Then he said to the 2 shipgirls, "Everyone has already successfully established roots in Britain and Eastern Europe, but Central and Northern Europe are still obvious blanks. So, I hope you can stay here to fill this blank." During the earlier discussion, the shipgirls had some disputes over the new companion's foothold. Some people believed that they should go to Germany to settle down, so that they could connect with the Soviet Union's forces in Eastern Europe, while another part of the people believed that since Grindelwald launched the First Wizarding War, the trauma suffered by the Central European region has not fully recovered until now. So staying there is not of great value, considering that the current educational center of the entire Central Europe is located in Durmstrang in Northern Europe. It is more reasonable for the newly arrived German shipgirls to focus their activities on Northern Europe. Finally, through voting, everyone chose the latter option. because although the various situations in the wizarding world and the ordinary world are related, they are actually somewhat different. The current situation is that Northern Europe's position in the magical world is indeed more important than Germany and those Central European countries, so everyone finally chose Northern Europe as the next core of operations. Chapter 179 Travel to the North. Over the next period, the Granger family traveled north by plane, visiting several cities and enjoying the beautiful natural and cultural scenery of Northern Europe. Hugo himself also took the opportunity to summon the 4 light cruiser ship girls, Königsberg, Karlsruhe, Cologne, and Emden. Perhaps because the most glorious moment of the German surface fleet during World War II was the Norwegian campaign, he was able to summon so many German ship girls during this time. Naturally, after they were summoned, they quickly went south to join Deutschland and the others, and then began to implement the previously planned plan through the Admiral network. Hugo learned that Deutschland and the others had successfully found a place to settle down in the suburbs of Oslo in just a few days, and had successfully conducted several transactions with a local wizarding black market. According to them, they could successfully establish themselves locally in just 1 month. However, also in this communication, Deutschland stated that the original plan might need to be changed, because bloodline discrimination in Northern Europe was too serious. In particular, the fact that Durmstrang only recruits pure-blood students has greatly fueled this atmosphere of bloodline discrimination, making it difficult for wizards with non-pure blood backgrounds like the German ship girls to fully integrate into the current environment. Sorry, I really didn't think of this, Hugo said, realizing some of the mistakes in his original arrangement after Deutschland mentioned it. He really didn't realize how much influence Durmstrang had on the entire Northern Europe at the beginning, but later, thinking about it, this is also a very reasonable thing. After all, as the strongest magic school in the entire Northern Europe, countless talents come from Durmstrang, and then these people will in turn influence the magical society of Northern Europe. If this is the case, then you should put the core force in a country in Central Europe. Hugo naturally wouldn't stubbornly insist that the ship girls must put their core base in Northern Europe. Given the situation, however, you don't need to give up on Northern Europe either. You can completely send a branch to do business here and collect information, that's for sure, Deutschland replied immediately after hearing Hugo's new order. The people here are exclusive, but not to the point of wanting to kill all non-pure blood wizards like you. Who must not be named and as Death Eaters back then. At least if you're doing business, they won't care about the bloodline of the wizards who will be doing business in the future. As long as they can provide the goods they want or are willing to offer a good price for the goods they want to sell in the process of doing business. After solving the problem of the Central European layout, Hugo and his family continued their northern journey. For example, they took a boat to admire the unique fjord scenery of Norway and the unique marine life of the North Atlantic, and finally went to Tromsø to admire the beautiful aurora. Because it is winter now, Tromsø, located in the Arctic Circle, is in the polar night. Although in this way, the Granger family basically has no way to observe and visit the city and the surrounding scenery. Coming to this city was not originally to see those fjords and marine life that are not much different from the south. This city has a nickname called the Paris of the North, which was given by a French tourist in the early 20th century. Because the number of restaurants, bars, nightclubs and cafes here is the highest in Norway, and it is still the case today, and even if the sky is dark, it will not hinder the operation of these places, and even this dark sky will bring a different flavor to these places. I came here when I was young. Back then I came with my classmates, Mr. Granger said with emotion, looking at the street in front of him. At that time, we got drunk in the bar and had a fight with other people, and then a drink cost me a full £300, which made me very cautious about spending money for a long time afterwards. So children, you must remember to drink as little as possible, especially not to get drunk, Mr. Granger said, looking at his son and daughter to warn them. Otherwise, not only will people get hurt, but you will also have to pay a high price for the things you break. And I think once you get drunk, your destructiveness may be even stronger than a group of young men. Are you talking about 15 years ago? Before Hugo and Hermione could say anything, Mrs. Granger said as if she suddenly remembered something. That time on my birthday, you made a necklace out of the bottom of a wine bottle and lied to me that this kind of handmade gift was more sincere. Darling, that's exactly the case. I put a lot of effort into that ring. Mr. Granger showed a slightly embarrassed smile, looking at his wife who was looking at him with a playful expression. Don't worry, the situation like getting drunk that time only happened once. I swear, I have never been drunk since we got married. Looking at the interaction between the parents, Hugo and Hermione smiled at each other. For them, Although their parents are both full-time employees and need to go to work for most of the day, so they can only meet in the morning and evening. However, the warmth of this family atmosphere is no worse than those families who spend more time together. For the city located in the Arctic Circle, the most attractive thing is naturally a series of buildings with the title of the northernmost. For example, the northernmost church in the world, and the northernmost museum in the world for the Granger family. These attractions are worth visiting carefully. In addition, there is also a beautiful scenery bestowed by nature, the aurora. In his previous life, Hugo had seen a series of travel notes about coming to this city to see the aurora on many websites. It's just that because the appearance of the aurora is full of randomness, not every tourist can see the aurora on their trip here. Hugo felt that his luck was very good in this regard, because they saw the beautiful aurora on the night they arrived. These brilliant, magnificent, and ever-changing beautiful bands of light slid across the night sky, just like the ribbons on the clothes of the gods flying in the sky. Tromsø is the northernmost point of the Granger family's trip. After finishing their trip to this city, they took one of the 3 buses that run every day to Narvik, the hometown of Hugo's maternal grandfather. According to the Granger family's previous plan, they would stay in the city of Narvik for a whole week, and then return to Tromsø 2 days before Christmas and take a plane to Oslo to spend Christmas with their grandfather's family. I never thought your father would buy that knife, Fearless, who had turned into a small blood-colored bat and was hiding in Hugo's inside pocket, said to Hugo through the Admiral network on the bus. But that's okay, at least you don't have to worry about whether you have enough fate points, and to be honest, it's a bit too cold to go out on winter nights. When traveling in Tromsø, Hugo originally planned to go east with Fearless to the edge of Hawkeye Island, which is not far from here, to Summon, North Carolina, but unexpectedly, Mr. Granger actually spent a full £300 in a traveler's shop to buy a knife made of North Carolina steel plate. Chapter 180: An Unexpected Meeting. Spending £300 on a knife might seem like an excessive expense to many, but it was nothing for Mr. Granger, a dentist. So, upon discovering that the knife came from the famous battleship Tirpitz, he immediately spent the money to buy this knife, which, in his eyes, was of great commemorative value. As for Hugo, after confirming that the knife his father bought could be used to summon a ship girl, he didn't need to run to that fjord in the east to summon the Tirpitz, especially since he didn't have enough fate points on hand right now. Being able to postpone some summonses was clearly better for him, at least avoiding the problem of not having enough fate points after arriving in Narvik. The Granger family quickly moved into the house where Hugo's maternal grandfather had lived. It was a 2-story building made of stone, looking grey and unremarkable, no different from the scattered houses on the plain around it, except that the interior clearly showed signs of renovation. Opening the door, directly facing it was a corridor. The corridor was lined with beautiful wallpaper. To the left of the corridor was a kitchen and dining room that didn't seem large, even appearing somewhat cramped. It looks alright. Considering my grandparents had 6 children, this house must have been very crowded back then. 6 children, that's incredible, Hermione said, her eyes widening. But I've never met Grandpa's siblings, because they either died very early or went to other countries, and then the connection between everyone slowly faded. Mrs. Granger said to the children, shaking her head. Alright, let's not talk about this. I'll go cook first, and you guys tidy up the house. We can eat together in a little while. After lunch, they decided to take a stroll by the sea. But unexpectedly, just as the Granger family arrived at the dock, they were surprised to see Enterprise and Indomitable standing on the dock, looking at the bay in front of them and talking. Professor Halsey, what are you doing here? Recognizing Enterprise, Hermione immediately stepped forward to greet her. Like during the summer vacation, you can just call me Enterprise. Nay, after all, this is off-campus leisure time, Enterprise said with a smile, waving her hand. We're here to take care of something, or rather, to look for a treasure. Oh, then we won't disturb you. Hearing Enterprise say this, Mr. Granger exchanged a few pleasantries with him and then left. After all, they were here to find a treasure, and it was indeed inappropriate for him to continue staying here and disturbing them. The person next to Enterprise should be the female owner of that newly opened magic shop in Diagon Alley, right? Hermione said to Hugo on the way back. It was during the conversation just now that Hermione recognized Indomitable's identity, a magical toolmaker in a former Auror. The thing that can make them personally go out to find must be very precious. Saying this, Hermione clenched her fists and placed them in front of her chest, her eyes suddenly shining brightly. Sure enough, Hermione, who possessed the characteristics of a Gryffindor student, also had a strong spirit of adventure, so her reaction was so strong after hearing this news, I think that after we're in our 5th year, maybe we'll have enough power to join those adventures, Hugo said, looking at his sister. And didn't we say we were going hunting this afternoon? I think taking this opportunity to learn how to shoot should be a good thing, because this was the hunting season in Norway. The Granger family had purchased licenses before coming and planned to go hunting. As for guns and the like, Grandpa had them here, so there was no need to rent them separately. You're right, instead of thinking about those things now, it's better to think about what to do when hunting this afternoon. After Hugo said this, Hermione's attention was immediately diverted to hunting as British people. The Granger family not only didn't dislike hunting, a somewhat bloody activity, but instead, their hearts were filled with a certain anticipation for this activity because in England, hunting is regarded as one of the exclusive sports of the nobility. Those traditional nobles often hunt collectively on various specific dates and places and use this occasion to socialize, and in such an environment, British middle-class families like the Grangers naturally also have a certain admiration for this activity. However, just as the Granger family was preparing for the afternoon's trip at their residence, Hugo contacted Enterprise through the Admiral network and asked her about the reason why she appeared in Narvik at this time. This is mainly related to you, Commander, Enterprise replied. After your grandfather told the story of his father's encounter, Formidable immediately passed the story on to me, considering that you will be staying in the Narvik area for a week during this time and will be hunting in the mountains. We specifically investigated what exactly happened in this area in 1945. Then you must have investigated something, Hugo immediately replied after hearing Enterprise say this. Otherwise, it would be enough for Formidable alone to protect me. There's no need for you and Indomitable to come together. We did investigate something, Enterprise chuckled. But the people who came this time are not just me and Indomitable. In addition to the two of us, Bletcher, St. George, and the renowned sisters have also come together. What exactly did you find? Hearing Enterprise say this, Hugo felt that he suddenly perked up. The thing that can make so many battleships move out is definitely not a small thing. Did you find the World Tree? No, actually we still don't know exactly what we found this time, Enterprise said. The reason why we came here is mainly because we accidentally discovered when checking the archives that the archives recorded that several ordinary people disappeared in 1945 in the place where your grandfather's father went. What's so strange about that? Hugo asked, puzzled. In that era, Norway was very chaotic due to the recent end of the war, and many people hoped to cross those forests and escape into neutral Sweden. However, the surroundings are all primeval forests, and the terrain is complex mountains. It should be very normal for those who have no experience to die in the forest with no remains. You're right, the surrounding environment here is indeed very good, and there are many kinds of wild animals. If ordinary people die in the mountains, they may be eaten in a few hours. After listening to Hugo's question, Enterprise nodded first, and then said, but if I tell you that the people who died here include more than 5 local old hunters, what would you think? That's not normal. Hugo immediately understood why Enterprise would be suspicious. Those old hunters are very confident in their abilities and won't go to particularly dangerous places. Moreover, the Germans surrendered in the late spring and early summer here, and the forest is far less dangerous than in winter. Even if something really happened to someone, it's impossible for it to happen to everyone. Chapter 181 Doubts and Calls. That's right, so after searching those files, we used some reliable contacts to look for records from the Norwegian Ministry of Magic regarding that period in this region. After hearing Hugo's affirmative answer, Enterprise immediately began to talk about what she and the other shipgirls had done after discovering the problem. Fortunately, because these things happened a long time ago and weren't classified events, the files are basically public, and anyone can access them upon request. At first, we focused our investigation on Norway. But after checking, we found that the files on the Norwegian side were very vague. Speaking of this, Enterprise clicked her tongue, expressing her dissatisfaction with the lax attitude of the Norwegian Ministry of Magic staff at the time. After flipping through several large volumes of files, we finally found records about this region at that time in a yellowed file. This record only contains a short sentence, roughly meaning that a group of aurors from the Swedish Ministry of Magic issued a cross-border request and were granted permission. And after a week, these Swedish wizards withdrew. This kind of thing is very rare, Hugo frowned and said. As a student who had been studying in the wizarding world for a year and a half, He was no longer as ignorant of everything in the magical world as he used to be based on his understanding of magical world common sense. It was obviously a very strange thing for the Ministry of Magic's Aurors to leave only this sentence in the files when crossing the border to perform a mission. You need to know that compared to the hit wizards who are the main force in performing various tasks of the Ministry of Magic, Aurors can be regarded as the core force of the magic ministries of various countries, and each one is the elite of the elite. Although many people apply for this profession every year, only a few can pass the various training and tests according to Javelin, who is currently undergoing Auror training. This kind of training can be completely comparable to the training intensity of those elite special forces in the ordinary human world, not to mention those who can't persevere. Even if some people go through such intensive training, very few Aurors can finally pass the assessment and officially take office. Taking Britain as an example, in this leading power in the Western magical world, it is common for no one to pass the assessment for several years. Therefore, the fact that the Swedish Ministry of Magic personnel stayed in Norway for a week, but only left a sentence in the files, naturally seemed very abnormal under normal circumstances. These elites would be closely monitored and detailed monitoring reports would be left behind as soon as they crossed a border. In fact, there may be detailed reports, but they should be classified reports that we can't see, Enterprise reported to Hugo, and it's impossible for us to rush into the Norwegian Ministry of Magic and snatch those classified reports. So what are your plans now? I don't think so many people came here to visit the Arctic Circle scenery. Hearing what Enterprise said, Hugo immediately asked, we only have one plan, and that is to investigate what happened in the place where your grandfather's father encountered those strange events back then. Enterprise replied directly, but the problem is that nearly half a century has passed, and if there really is anything wrong, there shouldn't be any traces left. Hugo was not very optimistic about Enterprise and her companion's actions. More importantly, a group of Swedish Aurors searched such a small area for a week. Even if there was anything, they might have taken it away or destroyed it long ago. I don't think there's much possibility of it remaining today. The conclusions we analyzed are exactly the opposite of yours, Indomitable said after connecting to the Admiral's network. If something important was really discovered back then, the Norwegian Ministry of Magic would definitely have reacted in some way, instead of showing no reaction at all, as the information we found before showed. Could it be because you only checked public information, so you can't find the corresponding content? Hugo asked. No, according to our analysis of public information, all the core members of the Norwegian Ministry of Magic were busy with their own affairs at the time, and no one participated in this incident. Indomitable directly denied Hugo's guess. I have to say that these wizards' level of file management is lower than that of ordinary people, so their attitude towards confidential files is just to remove those confidential parts. But through those public files, we can analyze where all the core personnel of the Norwegian Ministry of Magic were during that time, and what they did. But to be honest, only you can find these things from a pile of non-confidential files, Hugo said to the ship girls. To reach such a conclusion, one must browse a large amount of information and piece together the clues contained in those materials bit by bit. Considering that in order to avoid causing unnecessary annotations, it is impossible to use too many people and spend a lot of time to query these public materials. In this case, only the ship girls can sort out so much information under harsh premises. That night, after all the family members were asleep, Hugo left the guest room and met up with Enterprise, who was already waiting downstairs. Emden, who had rushed over during the afternoon, had taken Polyjuice potion and transformed into Hugo's appearance to temporarily replace him, in order to avoid being discovered by his family. Are these potions useful to you too? Looking at Emden, who was quickly transforming into another version of himself in front of him, Hugo's face was full of curiosity. Of course it's useful, but only when we are in our human form and have completely sealed off the ship girl's power inside our bodies. Enterprise shrugged her shoulders as she said this. But you don't have to worry about Emden's safety, because when we encounter certain dangers, our power will automatically unseal, and there won't be a situation where the seal can't be lifted, resulting in serious injury. That's good. Hearing what Enterprise said, Hugo also let go of his worries and began to pay attention to tonight's action. By the way, how is our action arranged for tonight? We'll go to Narvik Fjord first to summon some companions, and then everyone will go on tonight's adventure together, Enterprise said. At least from a safety point of view, it's better to call some more people for this adventure. Yes, I think you're right. Hugo nodded in approval, then entered the fjord area with Enterprise and began tonight's summoning work. Half an hour later, the entire summoning work was successfully completed among them. A group of ship girls were destroyers that belonged to the German side back then, such as Z-21, Z-22, Z-17, and Z-18, which sank in this fjord. In addition, there were also the Cossack and Eskimo destroyers belonging to the British side that participated in the war. However, to Hugo's surprise, he actually summoned the Warspite battleship in the fjord. How is that possible? Looking at Warspite, who was wearing a Victorian-style red dress, a look of surprise appeared on Hugo's face because compared to those legendary battles she had experienced, the Battle of Narvik should have been just a small scene for her. So Hugo never thought that he would be able to summon her in this place. Chapter 182 Start Search. Aren't you surprised? After performing a very ladylike curtsy, Warspite looked at Hugo with a smile. With so many destroyers here, how could I not be? Okay. After seriously considering Warspite's in-game settings, a knowing expression appeared on Hugo's face, and then he opened his arms enthusiastically and said, "Welcome back to port, Warspite." With the addition of 7 new ship girls, the strength of Hugo's team was obviously much greater than before, and they also had much more flexibility in personnel deployment. After briefly introducing this world and everyone's recent situation through the Admiral's network, Hugo and his party of 15 people walked into the mountains behind the city. As soon as they entered the forest, Enterprise, Audacious, and Indomitable released a large number of palm-sized carrier-based aircraft disguised as birds, spreading them out around themselves to establish a security net. Then, Headmaid Repulse squatted down, signaling Hugo to climb on her back and let her carry him forward. "Why don't we fly over there?" Hugo asked, somewhat puzzled, watching the shadows of the trees beside him fly backward quickly. Knowing that his speed in the forest would only slow everyone down, Hugo didn't act coy and directly let the headmaid carry him. However, on the way, he remembered the trip to Quincy shipyard last time when he took a plane, so he directly asked Enterprise the question that had been echoing in his mind, because this place is completely different from Quincy shipyard. At least, something that can keep a group of hours searching for a week will definitely not be simple. After hearing the Admiral's question, Enterprise replied through the Admiral's network while running, "Therefore, the other party is very likely to have left a lot of magic-related warning items in place. Although Indomitable's level should be able to deal with those traps and warning devices, it is easy to miss certain reconnaissance equipment if we go through the air. For most traps and reconnaissance equipment made with technological means, being able to operate for 3 to 5 years without maintenance is considered very good. However, in the magical world, various long-lasting reconnaissance equipment and traps emerge endlessly. According to Indomitable, she can completely use materials worth 1 galleon to create induction magic tools that can last for 50 years. Considering that Indomitable is more inclined to be all-round rather than specialized in alchemy, the shipgirls have reason to believe that the magic departments of various countries in the magical world, which hold a lot of power and resources, should have cheaper and better magic tools. It must be said that the shipgirls' approach of anticipating the enemy generously is still quite meaningful. Because just as they were approaching the target, Indomitable, who was walking in the front, suddenly raised a hand to stop everyone. "Be careful, there should be detection magic ahead." As she spoke, Indomitable took out several magic tools inlaid with grey agate from her belt and distributed them to everyone present. "Wear this on your body, and then press the grey crystal with your hand to activate it. This magic shielding tool will allow us to become invisible in front of these detection spells." About how many traps are there here? After entering the magic reconnaissance circle, Hugo asked Indomitable through the Admiral's network. For safety reasons, everyone remained silent at this time and used the Admiral's network as the only communication channel. "A lot, at least I've found no less than 10 kinds now," Indomitable said to Hugo while directing her carrier-based aircraft to investigate the surrounding environment with various magic tools. "But it's not all bad news. At least now I've discovered that many of these traps and detection tools have become ineffective due to disrepair over the years, and only a very small number are still operating normally." As she spoke, Indomitable led everyone to the side of a tree, and then used a metal staff with a crystal inlaid at one end to pry open the lichen covering the base of the tree. Seeing Indomitable's actions, everyone immediately lowered their heads and looked at the ground she had just cleared, and as a result, they immediately saw 2 discs that had almost lost their metallic luster embedded in the tree roots. The magic fluctuations of these 2 things are very similar, but they are independent of each other, Enterprise said after lighting up the 2 metal discs for a few seconds. Perhaps because of their innate physique, the shipgirl's sensitivity to various energy fluctuations is higher than that of flesh and blood creatures. Therefore, after approaching these 2 metal discs, They quickly felt that both metal plates were operating magic tools. Yes, to be precise, these are two warning magic tools with exactly the same function. Indomitable, as a professional, said directly, and the marks on them represent the Norwegian Ministry of Magic and the Swedish Ministry of Magic respectively. After hearing Indomitable's words, several ship girls immediately gathered around to observe carefully, and as a result, they indeed found the emblems belonging to the two magic departments on the metal discs. This place should have been an important area back then. Otherwise the two magic departments would not have prepared so many magic tools in this wilderness at the same time, Hugo analyzed from the side, but I don't know what happened later, and both parties should have given up the idea of continuing to explore in this area. But maybe because it was not convenient to end it so abruptly after a big show before, they prepared a pile of magic tools here as an ending. Commander, your analysis should be correct, Enterprise said, touching the brim of her hat. Although these traps and monitoring magic tools are not high-end goods, it costs a lot of money to deploy so many at once. Thinking this way, only your judgment can reasonably explain why those arrangers threw these things here and ignored them. After entering the restricted area, everyone's speed slowed down all of a sudden. Fortunately, the scope of this restricted area was not large, so Hugo and the others only spent 15 minutes to reach the entrance of the cave where Hugo's maternal grandfather's father encountered this strange incident. No one should have been here for decades, Courageous said after transforming into a bat and flying in to scout around, and there is nothing suspicious about the cave. Obviously, Hugo's maternal grandfather's father was just a lucky person who was accidentally discovered and rescued, so there was nothing suspicious about this cave. After confirming this, Hugo immediately went to the lake at the foot of the mountain with the ship girls to see if there were any abnormalities in this most suspicious place. The lake below is a glacial lake very common in fjord areas, and all the water comes from the surrounding glaciers and snowmelt, but now, the lake has turned into a mud pit the size of a football field, and the temperature drop in winter has turned the entire mud pit into a dirty ice lump. Obviously, the people from the two magic departments thoroughly searched this place half a century ago. After walking around the lake, Enterprise quickly came to a conclusion. This group of people used magic to block the small stream upstream of the lake as a water source, and then drained all the water in the lake, which also shows that this lake should be a core location where the incident occurred back then. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 183 Identify Your Goals. After the Enterprise made its assessment, the shipgirls immediately went down to the bottom of the muddy pit to search. Fortunately, it was winter, so the smell at the bottom of the muddy pit was still somewhat acceptable. Only a few minutes later, the shipgirls who had entered the bottom of the pit to search discovered some valuable clues in the mud. I remember you guys should have mastered magic already. Why don't you use magic to dig? Watching the shipgirls jump directly into the pit and use their hands to dig out all kinds of items, Hugo asked Intrepid, who was holding a frozen lump of mud, with some puzzlement. In fact, he had initially planned to go into the mud pit with the shipgirls to dig for things, because he felt that his attitude of watching the shipgirls work was not in line with the education he had received. However, after discovering that he really couldn't dig through the ice that was as hard as a rock, he could only stand on the edge of the pit, feeling quite depressed, and watch the girls working enthusiastically below. As I said before, safety first. As the temporary commander of the shipgirls, Enterprise answered Hugo's question. If we use magic here, I'm worried that it might attract the attention of the Swedish and Norwegian ministries of magic, at least from the point that the Trace can sense magic nationwide. We have every reason to suspect that the ministries of magic of various countries have built a magical surveillance network in their countries that is not very sensitive but has a wide coverage. The ministries of magic of various countries may not pay much attention to casting spells in most areas, but it's hard to say for these key monitoring areas. Therefore, for safety reasons, I think our current pure physical means of excavation is more appropriate, and to be honest, the efficiency of our manual excavation is not much worse than using magic. After Enterprise finished speaking, Intrepid waved a lump of black ice in her hand and said, "And we have now discovered things far beyond our previous expectations." 20 minutes later, the shipgirls finished searching the mud pit and collected various items that could fill a gasoline, and then they began to use small chisels, drills, or climbing tools to remove the dirty ice that wrapped the items. Soon, a large pile of things was cleaned out. Some were obviously thrown in by ordinary people who didn't know magic, such as various daily items and weapons from the Middle Ages to the present, some of which should still have the value of certain cultural relics. However, about 1/5 of the things were identified because these things could clearly show traces left by the magical world. These things are the main suspects, pointing to the pile of things that could be identified as belonging to the magical world, Intrepid said to Hugo. According to my appraisal, these things should have been thrown into that pool 50 years ago. If there are no accidents, these things should have a direct connection with the incident that year. What do you see from here? Hugo asked with some puzzlement. Because he saw that the things in front of him contained bones, metal fragments, broken gold jewelry, and even broken wooden sticks, looking like a pile of old garbage. Basically, he couldn't see where it was related to wizards and the magical world. Details, my admiral, the key is details, Intrepid said. Taking out a piece of half a cow's shoulder blade and pointing to the missing part. If you look closely, you will find that the missing part of the cow's shoulder blade was bitten off directly. It's nothing for a cow to be bitten to death by a beast. Wait, there shouldn't be any cows in this place. After being reminded by Intrepid, Hugo quickly saw the problem with the cow's shoulder blade, and the tooth marks on it are also wrong. They don't look like ordinary beasts. After taking the bone that had just been washed clean by the ship girl, Hugo quickly saw the problem. It looks a bit familiar. Wait, this tooth mark seems to have been bitten out by a large human. Yes, in addition to this large tooth mark, other things found at the scene also point to this point, Intrepid said. Pointing to the large pile of things that had just been discarded on the side like garbage, everything is one size larger, and it looks like it was used by giants or trolls, such large humanoid creatures. That makes sense. Hugo snapped his fingers. My grandfather's father said that he saw things like small mountains moving by this lake, and if it's these giant creatures, everything can be explained. Obviously, some well-equipped giant humanoid creatures appeared by this lake back then, and then probably died here. Looking at the large muddy pool in front of him, Hugo roughly guessed what might have happened here, and we think that the ones active here back then should be trolls rather than giants, Enterprise said, kicking the bones next to her with her foot. These bones have traces of being cut with sharp weapons or left by teeth, proving that these things should be the food of those giant creatures back then, but all the bones found at the scene are raw, without any traces of being cooked. This doesn't seem like something giants would do. Yes, you're right. Recalling some books about trolls and giants that he had seen before, Hugo immediately understood the reason why Enterprise made this judgment. Although giants are barbaric, they have become accustomed to using fire. At the same time, they basically eat cooked food when they eat, but trolls generally eat raw food like beasts. At least, these well-equipped giants must eat cooked food. But why would a group of fully armed trolls appear in this desolate place? Looking at the pile of things on the ground, Hugo showed a thoughtful expression. And why would they die here in a battle? After confirming the specific identities of the creatures who died here, just now they checked the information on all the valuable fragments on the spot from the fragments of weapons and equipment on the ground. The people present, through careful inspection, found that these broken metals were almost all fragments of various weapons and equipment made for these trolls, with various traces of damage on them. If you pay attention, you will find that the gaps in these fragments have different scars left on them, some of which have molten edges due to high-temperature flames, while others have been directly cut open by some extremely powerful force. After carefully examining each item, Intrepid obtained more information from the fragments. This is obviously caused by magic, otherwise, it is impossible to leave such traces on these items mixed with trace amounts of magical metal. You know, trolls have very poor ability to make weapons themselves, and leather aprons and big-headed sticks are already the limit. Therefore, these equipment on them must have been created by people similar to wizards or fairies, in the magical definition, so the group of fully armed trolls here back then should have been mercenaries of a large force. Considering that this set of equipment is not cheap, and that these fragments we found come from at least 11 or 12 different sets of equipment, I think there are only a handful of forces that can do this in the last 100 years. Yes, there are not many people and forces who can spend a lot of money to arm trolls. Hugo nodded. Chapter 184 Information. Besides the traces left by the armored giants here, what else have you found? Hugo asked, looking at the pile of large equipment fragments on the ground. Is there anything left behind, like items related to wizards? Of course, look here. I found 5 or 6 fragments that originally belonged to the same wand. Not worried said, taking out a few pieces from the pile of debris that looked like completely charred toothpicks. When wands are made, they are often imbued with magic to prevent damage from fire, breakage, and other conventional methods. The duration of this magic depends on the wand's age and how well it's maintained, and this wand in my hand was clearly damaged by a severe spellcasting error during the casting of dark magic. This indicates that the battle that took place here was very intense. Even though only some fragments were left, Hugo and the others obtained a great deal of information thanks to Not Worried's careful research and analysis. As a professional, the best news for them now was that the area they needed to search next was greatly reduced because the information contained in these equipment fragments clearly indicated one thing: a magical battle did indeed break out here years ago, and both sides, or one side, involved in the war used armored giants. The reason for drawing such a conclusion was simple. They had read a large number of books that all pointed out one thing: although giants have insufficient intelligence, they can be trained into qualified thugs or guards. However, considering the giants' terrible appetite, the difficulty of training due to their low intelligence, and the cost of the equipment found on site, it can be known that the battle that broke out here was definitely an almost evenly matched battle between two major forces, a force that could fight the Swedish Ministry of Magic's elite horror squad to a standstill 50 years ago. Hugo frowned and searched his memory. Soon, he thought of something. Could it be the Wizengamot? That's the most likely guess. Not War nodded in agreement. Think about the series of exile organizations established by that group of Germans after World War II. I think even if Grindelwald was defeated that year, with his charm at the time, it's very possible that the Wizengamot still maintained its structure and gathered together to prepare to do something. So, what we are likely looking for now is something related to Grindelwald. Hugo shrugged after hearing Not War's words. This is really good news, considering that Grindelwald's power swept across the entire Europe except for the United Kingdom. The Wizengamot was likely to have plundered a huge amount of resources from this land according to some records they had searched before. In the liquidation process after the end of the war, the various resources that were plundered and finally returned to the victims, plus the part that was taken over by the Ministry of Magic after the victims could not be found, added up to less than 1/5 of the lost amount. Indeed, resources and wealth are consumed in large quantities during war, and whether it is the Wizengamot or the Ministry of Magic, when they own these wealth, they will also lose a part of it. But even considering all these consumptions and losses, at least half of the wealth that was plundered back then is now in an unknown state. That was the Wizengamot that ran rampant throughout Europe and established powerful forces in the Mediterranean region and the United States outside of Europe, and anyone with a brain would know how huge a wealth their decades of accumulation would be. Of course, based on the organizational situation of Grindelwald's subordinates back then, the batch of people assigned to Narvik should only be a very small part. Even if there really brought wealth, it would only be a small part of those wealth. But these things that may be a very small part of the wealth for the Wizengamot and Grindelwald would be an astronomical wealth for Hugo and the others. Of course, the matter of the Wizengamot's treasure is only Hugo and the others' analysis based on the records of the time and the information obtained from the items salvaged from the bottom of this mud pit. However, considering human nature and the possible value of this wealth, Hugo and the others felt that it was a very worthwhile thing to spend time and energy searching here. After thoroughly inspecting the pit and confirming that there was nothing left, the ship girls under Hugo's command began to search outward in a spiral pattern with this mud pit as the core. A few minutes later, St. George, who was searching near the east, discovered a suspicious place. "Everyone, come and take a look," St. George contacted through the Admiral network. There seemed to be some obvious traces of artificial intervention here. After hearing St. George's words, everyone immediately ran towards the place where she was. When everyone appeared in that forest, they found that the snow and fallen leaves under St. George's feet had been dug away, revealing the moss below. Hugo walked closer and found that these mosses looked no different from ordinary mosses, but after thinking about what St. George had just said and observing carefully, he suddenly noticed that there was a straight line formed by the same species of moss in these mosses. This straight line is obviously the result of artificial intervention. St. George pointed to the ground with a shovel in her hand and said, "And what we have to do next is to see what this line wants to express." Understanding the next task, Hugo and the others immediately started to clean the ground along both sides of the line. Soon, a pattern of about 7 or 8 square meters appeared in front of Hugo and the others. This is a strange triangular symbol, composed of an outer triangle, an inner circle, and a vertical line that divides the entire symbol in half. It looks like a triangular eye since the force represented by the symbol has disappeared for nearly half a century. Most people may not know what this symbol means, but for Hugo and those under his command who have obtained a lot of information from another world, they recognized at the first time when they cleaned up this symbol that this was Grindelwald's symbol back then, representing the Deathly Hallows. It seems that our previous guess was correct. The force that fought against the Swedish Ministry of Magic back then really belonged to the Wizengamot, Enterprise said with a sigh, looking at the symbol on the ground, and if there really is a treasure, it shouldn't have been discovered by anyone. Not worried continued, and then quickly introduced the mysteries here to Hugo through the Admiral network. If the magic ministries of the two countries had really discovered this symbol back then, they would have dug 3 feet into the ground in this place to look for all kinds of clues, and the fact that there are no traces of being touched here can only indicate one thing, that is, neither of the magic ministries discovered the secret of this place. The thing used to make the mark is a cold zone wasp that can have a lifespan of hundreds of years. As an alchemist, Not Worried memorized a lot of information in her mind, so she searched for the content about this moss, and the first time, obviously, this is to convey some kind of information to future generations. Chapter 185 Target Lock. Realizing that this symbol belonging to Grindelwald and the pure-blood supremacists was some kind of signal for posterity, the shipgirls immediately surrounded the symbol and began to observe it. Soon, everyone found more information from this symbol. According to my observation, this moss has been growing here for at least 60 years without being moved. After transforming into a bat, Formidable went forward to smell the moss and then said to Hugo through the Admiral network, that is to say, this place was chosen and developed into some kind of base or something similar back when Grindelwald was at his zenith. It's not that strange for a pure-blood supremacist base to appear in this place. After all, Grindelwald's alma mater, Durmstrang, is located in a fjord somewhere in Norway. Establishing a base here would make it easier to observe the school's movements and recruit new people. Of course, this gathering place belonging to the pure-blood supremacists back then was likely public, so after Grindelwald was defeated, this area was raided by the Aurors of the Swedish Ministry of Magic. This presents a very abnormal situation. Since this place was public and the overall area was not very large, then why didn't the Aurors who raided it discover this place back then? You need to know that the Aurors of various countries are elite who have undergone special training, including searching for various items. So the fact that this mark on the ground was never discovered naturally seems a bit strange. I think they may have been looking in the wrong direction, Indomitable said at this time, while transmitting some pictures and short videos to Hugo through the Admiral network. This is what I just discovered on the other side. It's the remains of a semi-underground 3-story building hidden underground. If there are no accidents, this is the core building complex of the base back then. Therefore, this place was also the focus of the Auror's search. At least my reconnaissance plane tells me that the underground 3-story ruin is cleaner than if a dog had liked it. Nothing was left except for some worthless debris. In this case, the other party must have focused on that building instead of this remote wilderness back then. In addition, moss is not a magical plant. If you simply look at it with your eyes, it is difficult to distinguish it from the surrounding moss. Besides, those ordinary wizards not only don't have the vision of us shipgirls that far exceeds humans, but also rely heavily on their magic instead of their naked eyes. So even if they searched here several times, they didn't find this crucial symbol. That makes a lot of sense. Hugo nodded in agreement. After all, when there are buildings, the other party will most likely focus their search on those man-made buildings, and there may be insufficient search efforts in these wilderness areas, so it is not surprising that they did not find this symbol because the area covered by the symbol was not large. The shipgirls quickly used the metal probes they carried to cast magic to check the situation under this piece of land. There are no artificial objects under here. In less than 10 minutes, the shipgirls thoroughly checked the area under this piece of land. The other party shouldn't have buried anything down there. Then where could this thing be? Z-22, who came with them, asked in confusion. While frowning and looking at the symbol belonging to Grindelwald on the ground, I think we can look over there. After circling the symbol a few times, Hugo suddenly had a flash of inspiration and pointed to the position pointed to by the corner above the symbol. Maybe those people used this symbol as an arrow to remind future generations. Possible. After listening to Hugo's analysis, Enterprise, Formidable, and Indomitable immediately launched reconnaissance planes and chased after the place pointed to by the tip of the sign below. Soon, several planes surrounded a tree as thick as a person. This tree should have been planted in that era. After circling the tree, Z-21 said in a very affirmative tone, "I've been here for more than half a century. I know very well how long it takes for a tree to grow to a certain thickness in this area, Since they thought the tree was suspicious, Hugo and the others naturally wouldn't let it go. Fortunately, this place was already outside the range of the magical reconnaissance that the Aurors had previously set up, so the ship girls quickly dug out a box under the roots of the tree using magic. This box was made of lead and looked only the size of a palm. The place where the box body was connected to the box lid was completely sealed with sealing wax, which seemed to be to keep the materials inside the box from being damaged soon. Indomitable took out a metal plate engraved with a magic circle and placed it on the ground and activated it, then used the tool in her hand to remove the sealing wax from the gap in the box and opened the box. "This is really a good thing," Indomitable said as she reached into the box and took out a palm-sized tooth that glowed with a soft white light. "If I'm not mistaken, this should be the tooth of the legendary Kraken," Indomitable said after carefully examining the tooth in front of her with magic. "This is a very precious potion material and alchemy raw material for wizards, especially this kind of tooth whose internal structure has been completely stabilized after hundreds of years. How much is this thing worth?" Hugo pointed to the tooth in Indomitable's hand and asked. "This one is probably worth 500 to 600 galleons, and it's priceless. If I'm willing to auction it, I can easily get 800 galleons. Indomitable thought for a moment and then said to Hugo, "That is indeed a great fortune." After listening to Indomitable's words, Hugo sighed, and then said in a somewhat puzzled voice, "But the problem now is that if it's just a few hundred galleons, the two sides shouldn't have made such a big fuss." Thinking of this, Hugo put on gloves and checked the tooth and the lead box containing the tooth. The tooth was normal. There was nothing wrong with it. But after carefully scraping off the oxide layer inside the lead box, Hugo saw 2 lines of numbers engraved with sharp tools on the specially reinforced bottom of the box. 68,525,994, 1,734,170. What do these 2 lines of numbers mean? After seeing clearly what was carved on the bottom of the box, Hugo raised his head in confusion. "It can't be Gringotts' vault number, but I remember that Gringotts shouldn't have so many vaults. This may be latitude and longitude," St. George suddenly said. As ship girls, the data they come into contact with most often is the latitude and longitude when sailing, so they thought of this aspect immediately. But even if these 2 lines of data represent latitude and longitude, there should be many ways to divide them. "How do we know which place it is?" Hugo frowned. "Don't forget, there is a Kraken's tooth in the box. So it should remind us that this place should be in the North Sea area," Enterprise said with a smile, "so we should be able to filter out most of the wrong answers." A few minutes later, the ship girls narrowed the target to 2 points. These 2 points were all within the range of the North Sea, but one was in the depths of the North Sea, and the other was in a fjord in northern Norway. Chapter 186 North Sea Island. The weather in the North Sea in December was terrible, with low-hanging clouds. Coupled with the polar nights unique to high-latitude regions, the entire sky appeared gloomy, merging with the iron-gray waves of the sea. However, even in these harsh weather conditions, several TBM torpedo planes painted with blue paint howled southward at a speed that no propeller aircraft could possibly achieve. "My dear Admiral, can you hold on?" Hugo, sitting in the bombardier's position in the center of one of the planes, heard Enterprise's voice in his headset. "Don't worry, not sleeping for one night is nothing to me, especially since Illustrious gave me a bottle of magic potion beforehand," Hugo replied spiritedly. "Yesterday, after finding some clues at that abandoned Saint base, Hugo and the others took off overnight, heading straight for the 2 target points to begin their search. The first place they went was the fjord because it was the closer of the 2 points to Hugo and the others. Unfortunately, when they arrived, they found that the fjord was very ordinary. At least, the water depth didn't seem deep enough to hide a giant monster like the Kraken of the North Sea. Later searches also proved this point. The ship girls took turns diving into the water and thoroughly searched the area, but found no traces of any giant creature activity. After eliminating the point that was too close, Hugo and the others could only turn their attention to the point located in the North Atlantic. However, considering the harsh weather conditions in this area and the potential dangers in the deep sea, Hugo and the others decided to go to Iceland first to summon the supply ship out. In that way, even if they encountered any accidents at the point located in the deep sea area of the North Atlantic, they would have the confidence to deal with those accidents with logistics personnel present. Although Enterprise was able to make her Avenger torpedo planes fly at supersonic speeds because Hugo had equipped her with the Eagle 302, even so, the journey to Iceland to recruit Odin and then head to that destination still took Hugo an entire night. This was why Enterprise was so concerned and asked Hugo about it. because she was worried that Hugo might be a little lacking in energy after not sleeping for a night. In fact, this concern was unnecessary. After obtaining multiple avatars, Hugo's body was now better than most young and middle-aged men, and with illustrious magic potion, not sleeping for just one night was nothing to him. It's 10 a.m. now. If there are no accidents, we should be able to see the target location in 5 minutes, Enterprise's voice came from the headset. I hope the deep-sea salvage work that follows won't be too much trouble. After Enterprise finished speaking, Hugo immediately heard the rustling sounds of the other ship girls organizing various items through the headset. Considering that they might encounter the Kraken of the North Sea face-to-face this time, the ship girls were all starting to organize their own equipment and prepare to enter the battle at any time. What's going on? Just as everyone was preparing for battle, Hugo suddenly heard Enterprise's soft exclamation in his headset, and then he heard a crackling sound from outside the plane. Turning his head to look at the side of the glass canopy, Hugo was surprised to see small sparks constantly bursting out on the wings and fuselage, as if they were being strafed by a machine gun. Is the plane okay? Feeling that the plane was only shaking slightly, Hugo felt much relieved. But even so, he still asked Enterprise behind him somewhat nervously, "Everything is normal. It's just that some of the magic defenses that Illustrious prepared on the plane before coming have failed." Speaking of this, Enterprise paused for a moment, and then continued. "And I feel that the magic environment outside is now undergoing some changes. This is a chaotic magic zone." Illustrious, who had stronger professional skills in this area, said at this time, stating her observations. "So, those magic protection runes that I casually placed around the outside of the plane have basically all exploded. This is because the surrounding variable magic turbulence caused those simple and unprotected magic runes to directly overload and become scrap. And now the biggest problem is that the difficulty of casting spells in a chaotic magic zone is several times higher than in ordinary areas. Even for most ordinary wizards, they will lose their ability to cast spells here." St. George also joined the conversation at this time. "Fortunately, with our level, the environment here doesn't have a big impact on us. At most, we just need to pay a little attention when using our power." "That's good," Hugo sighed softly, and just at this moment, a dark-looking island appeared on the sea below them. Chaotic magic zones not only disrupt the spellcasting of all spellcasters, but also form various obstacles locally that prevent ordinary people from discovering them. That's why our previous nautical charts didn't mark this place. Enterprise, who also saw the island, introduced to Hugo. Moreover, the Witches' Society who discovered this island back then also concealed the information about this island, so we can't find this island on the maps of the wizarding world either. That's good news. At least, if there really is some treasure hidden here, the probability of others getting there first and making us run in vain is obviously much smaller," Hugo said with a smile. While Hugo and the ship girls were talking, the plane had already crossed a distance of tens of kilometers and arrived near the island, and then they all landed on the island. However, the plane that Hugo was currently in did not land, but continued to circle in the air because according to the plan that everyone had discussed in advance, Hugo, as the Admiral, could provide various tactical bonuses to the surrounding ship girls. So he should stay around everyone to prepare for possible battles. But considering Hugo's current fragility in front of the ship girls and the potential dangers below, it was obviously a very stupid idea to let Hugo directly enter the battlefield. So, after a brief discussion, everyone decided to let Enterprise fly the plane in circles over the battlefield to buff everyone. Of course, this does not mean that Enterprise will not participate in this battle. She just opened the cockpit cover above her head and released all of her carrier-based aircraft squadrons. "Everything is normal below," St. George reported, deploying her ship equipment and walking on this black island, which was about 10 soccer fields in size. "The only problem now is that the stench in this place is really too strong. If it weren't for the consideration that some clues might come from the smell, I would definitely block out my sense of smell now, because this island was not large." The ship girls quickly searched the entire island. Roughly this wet, rugged, and almost lifeless island was a masterpiece formed after an underwater volcanic eruption. Because after approaching, everyone clearly saw that the entire island was a caldera at the same time. Due to this reason, the entire island was composed of basalt from volcanic eruptions and a small amount of obsidian, looking pitch black. Chapter 187 Kraken. Just as St. George and several large warship ship girls circled the island, finding no clues, they were preparing to go to the most conspicuous volcanic crater on the island to see if there would be any new discoveries. At this moment, The destroyer ship girls who had landed on the island and were patrolling the surrounding sea also used their sonar to catch something and warned everyone on the field through the Admiral network. There seems to be a big guy approaching underwater 5,000 to 6,000 meters away. The Cossack, patrolling the north of the island, was the first to issue a warning. The other side is very fast, approaching this island at a speed close to 30 knots. In fact, the shipgirl's sonar performance is very good, but the huge waves in this area and the chaotic energy flow in the chaotic magic area affect everyone's sonar, so that the other party was only perceived when they came so close. Everyone immediately assembles and prepares to fight. I guess the owner of this island is back now. Enterprise quickly issued a combat readiness order, and then asked the destroyers, "Do you have any more detailed information?" 300 meters. The other side is more than 300 meters long. Z-21 slightly nervous voice rang in the Admiral network. After all, when facing a guy bigger than yourself, this kind of tension is inevitable, especially since the distance of 300 meters is longer than all the shipgirl prototypes present, not to mention that is the legendary Kraken. It may have some extraordinary abilities that others don't know. The other side is decelerating. It seems the target is this volcanic island. The Cossack, who is in the northernmost position, shouted immediately, and at the same time began to drive south to join his companions to prepare for battle. The large shipgirls who had been exploring the island also quickly came to the coastline along a straight line, and then quickly drove towards the direction the big guy was rushing from. Suddenly, several huge tentacles, each as thick as 3 to 5 people could hug, suddenly pierced upwards from underwater. Fortunately, the shipgirls knew the location of these tentacle attacks in advance through sonar and the Admiral network, so they successfully avoided this fatal attack that suddenly launched from below the sea. Fire, fire. After seeing the target, the shipgirls immediately used the weapons on their ship equipment to attack the tentacles in front of them. At the same time, the various aircraft that had been released also began to drop bombs on these tentacles. In this cluster of dense flames, the tentacles continued to stretch into the sky as if they were not affected at all, without being affected by the impact, flames, and flying shrapnel formed by the explosions. This tentacle is not right. Looking at the tentacles stretching into the air like a pagoda, Indomitable risked the loss of aircraft to conduct a close reconnaissance and discovered something was wrong. There is a layer of highly defensive scales on the tentacles, and there is also a layer of magical defense. The effect of our various weapons on this layer of defense is not good. Through the pictures and short videos sent back by Indomitable's carrier-based aircraft before being destroyed by the tentacles, Hugo was surprised to find that these tentacles, which should belong to the Kraken, did not look like the body structure that a mollusk should have at all, but rather looked like giant pythons, because on these tentacles, Hugo found that there was a layer of huge scales that looked as big as a wash basin. In addition, a layer of green translucent magic shields flashed on these scales from time to time, blocking most of the attacks. Everyone, add magic power to the attacking ammunition and concentrate on killing. Enterprise, who discovered that only direct hits from large caliber naval guns and bombs could cause effective damage to these tentacles, immediately changed tactics. Obviously, these defenses far exceeded everyone's previous expectations. Especially Indomitable found that this layer of scales had an extremely high defense ability against various physical attacks, so she immediately issued a new order to the shipgirls, asking everyone to inject magic power into these shells and bombs to change the original attack method, and at the same time, to increase the attack energy level by reducing the damage range in an instant. A layer of magical halos of different colors immediately appeared on the ammunition to be fired, and then they were stuffed into the gun chambers and fired at these tentacles. Sure enough, after injecting magic power into those shells and bombs, the lethality of all the ammunition immediately increased by more than one level. In this way, the defense on the tentacles could not be stopped. All of a sudden, in the sound of explosions, large pieces of scales and the body tissues below peeled off from the tentacles and fell into the sea. At the same time, one after another large holes that could fit 1 or 2 adults appeared, but soon, a large amount of liquid gushed out from the tentacle wounds, sealing the wounds and hardening. Even if almost half of the muscle tissue on a certain tentacle was destroyed, it could still maintain its original combat effectiveness. However, as time went by, the shipgirls created more and more wounds on the monster, and the frequency of the monster waving its tentacles also began to slowly decrease. But strangely, even though the situation has reached this point, this monster did not run away like a normal creature, but stayed in place and fought Hugo and the others to the death. This seems a bit wrong, Hugo thought. But as soon as this thought appeared in his mind, a sharp sound like fingernails scratching glass suddenly came from below the sea. making people feel dizzy and bloated, and the entire sea surface rolled like boiling water, and then a huge bulge gradually rose from the sea surface with a bang. The bulge burst open, and the huge waves that were stirred up were as high as 100 meters, roaring loudly, even better than the thunder in winter. And the Kraken, which had been hiding below the water, finally revealed its figure. This is a green, sack-like sphere that looks like a bitter gourd, about the size of a common 2-story residential building. The top is covered with the same scales as the tentacles, and on both sides of the head are inlaid with a blood-red sphere, which should be the eyes of this Kraken. The periphery of the eyes is surrounded by a circle of small tentacles as thick as human arms, constantly wriggling. From time to time, some mucus is secreted to scrub the monster's eyeballs. Sure enough, it is the Kraken. Although the tentacles and the teeth had conveyed some information to Hugo and the others before, it was not until now that everyone could be sure what enemy they were facing. In fact, the Kraken is also a legend even in the wizarding world. Although wizards and muggles have constantly witnessed this monster in the North Atlantic region, almost no one has left evidence that can be used as evidence. This is why the Kraken is not recorded in the book Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, because Newt Scamander only recorded creatures that were confirmed to exist when he was editing this book, and the Kraken was obviously not in his eyes. The Kraken that emerged from the water vigorously waved its tentacles and sprayed dark green liquid in an attempt to attack the surrounding ship girls, but they were easily dodged. Only some carrier-based aircraft that were too close were shot down by these attacks. The Kraken in front of us is an undead creature, St. George said suddenly. At this time, as the one who masters the power of the holy light, she quickly sensed the situation of the Kraken in front of her after fighting for a while, and judging from its current actions, this should be an artificial undead creature similar to an abomination. Chapter 188 Fierce Battle. Who the hell did this? Hugo spat out the words from between his teeth after hearing St. George's words. Because such a large North Sea Kraken, if it were an undead creature, would represent a level of difficulty that had increased by more than just 1 degree. After all, this kind of huge, soft-bodied magical creature was already very powerful, but after becoming an undead creature, it not only greatly increased its defense by more than 1 level, but also lost the vital weak points that the original creature would have had. For example, now that the ship girls' attacks landed on this North Sea Kraken zombie, they could indeed blow off a lot of flesh and create many wounds, while also affecting the giant zombie's movements. But then, this zombie's body could always produce a massive amount of dark green liquid to fill those wounds, and then form something like hard rubber to block the lost parts and replace the lost functions. In the following battle, the ship girls were surprised to find that these dark green colloids were actually no less defensive than the scales and muscles on those monsters. Even after repeated testing, they believed that if they didn't consider the magic defense aspect, these colloids were even stronger than the original monster's limbs. However, this defense was not impenetrable, because the ship girls also discovered during the attack process that this powerful regenerative ability and equally powerful physical defense ability were achieved by weakening the magic defense ability. This is why this North Sea Kraken stitched corpse was far stronger in energy level than when it was alive, but not much stronger in pure magic defense than before. Of course, this not much stronger than before was only relative to when the North Sea Kraken was alive. If compared to an ordinary wizard, this North Sea Kraken could even be seen as invincible. Realizing the characteristics of the North Sea Kraken stitched corpse in front of them, the ship girls adjusted the magic they attached to their ammunition to holy light and fire. After being attacked by these targeted ammunition, the speed at which the dark green liquid replenished suddenly slowed down, which in turn directly affected the North Sea Kraken's combat effectiveness. Taking advantage of the North Sea Kraken's decreased agility, the ship girls began to concentrate their fire on the weak points on the Kraken's body. Although this Kraken should no longer have fatal weaknesses after becoming an undead creature, some of the original body structure's inherent flaws did not seem to have been compensated for. In an instant, all the destroyers and torpedo planes flying around in the sky simultaneously released torpedoes, forming a sea of torpedoes, forcing the giant North Sea Kraken zombie in front of them to retract its claws to deal with the underwater threat. Taking advantage of this opportunity, the large ship girls and bombers simultaneously switched to armor-piercing shells and aimed at the 2 blood-red eyes on the monster's head. When this giant monster discovered that these shells and bombs were attacking its eyes, it was too late to retract its tentacles, so it could only rely on the small tentacles around its eyes to block those attacks. However, the speed of the shells was obviously far beyond the upper limit of speed that biological structures could achieve, so those tentacles only had time to make a little movement before being directly smashed into the eyes by those shells and bombs. In an instant, The two blood-red eyes were instantly shattered by those shells and bombs infused with the power of fire and holy light. Then, more ammunition continued to rush into the monster's head. However, these shells and bombs only penetrated less than a meter before stopping, because they seemed to have hit some kind of barrier and were blocked as those shells and bombs exploded. The flesh around the monster's eyes was directly blown open into two large pieces. Then, a cluster of emerald-like translucent crystals appeared inside the wound. Sure enough, even if nothing could be seen from the outside, the guy who created this monster back then obviously considered this point and made a strong defense inside. The guy who can create this kind of monster is definitely a top-notch bastard. Looking at those emerald green crystals, Hugo couldn't help but curse. I have a way. St. George's voice suddenly sounded in the Admiral network. Next, you have to hold back all of this monster's tentacles and buy me 10 seconds. Understood, Roger. The ship girls answered one after another, and then began to shoot at the monster with all their might. Different from what Hugo imagined, the destroyer's torpedo attack seemed to have a better effect at this time. Because most of this monster's body was hidden underwater, the underwater strikes were obviously stronger than the surface strikes. This monster didn't run away like a normal creature for some reason, but that didn't mean it couldn't do anything about those attacks. Realizing that it couldn't stop the rain-like attacks with just those tentacles, the North Sea Kraken zombie immediately released a massive amount of dark green mist around itself in an instant. Both the shells and bombs were swallowed by this mist, and at the same time, the ship girls found that they had completely lost contact with those weapons. Damn it, this mist is corrosive. Indomitable noticed the situation was wrong at the first moment. In this case, the 10 seconds that St. George wanted were naturally out of the question. It would be great if Illustrious was here. Seeing the scene, Enterprise, as the commander-in-chief, sighed softly. Because the power that this monster possessed was obviously a kind of area attack, and St. George, who possessed the power to restrain this kind of power, was a paladin and didn't have the skills to neutralize this kind of area attack. More importantly, as the only one present who could kill this monster with one blow, she couldn't suppress the opponent with an area attack while charging up to prepare to deliver that fatal blow to the monster. Actually, I can too. Before Enterprise could finish her words, a somewhat unfamiliar, childish voice sounded in the Admiral network. Odin, you're not a combat ship. Hugo paused for a moment before realizing. The one speaking now was Odin, who had just been summoned from Iceland a few hours ago. Yes, but I have a special refit. And that refit allows me to connect to the power of mythology, Odin said rather proudly. So I can cooperate with St. George to kill this monster. Won't you be hurt by this? Hugo asked. Because he knew that the power of these ship girls was closely linked to their prototype, so for Odin, who was only a small patrol boat before, it would definitely cost something to deliver such a blow. I will only be briefly exhausted for a week, and I won't suffer permanent damage. When asked by the Admiral, Odin could only tell the truth. So let me try it. Even if it fails, there won't be too much danger. Okay. After Odin said this, Hugo agreed to his approach. Because ship girls are born to fight. Refusing her to participate in the battle at this time is actually a huge humiliation to her. Soon, Odin came to the front line from the rear where everyone had been protecting her, and then stretched out the spear in her hand towards the giant monster. Chapter 189 Victory. These are all my names. I am known as the War God Grimm. I am the one-eyed god, also called the Supreme God, the Seeker of Truth, standing on the front line of the battle. Odin, at this moment, donned a giant god Odin's ship gear and roared loudly at the monster, pointing with a spear in her hand as one ancient Viking word after another came from her mouth. The sea churned even more violently than before, and streaks of purple lightning flashed across the sky as a prototype, merely a small patrol ship. Odin can connect to the legendary gods through her name and unleash power comparable to those of the main battleship girls, but the price she has to pay is also considerable besides a clear deficiency in sustained combat capability. Odin also requires a longer time to prepare before unleashing this attack. This attack preparation period is naturally a fatal weakness for Odin. Fortunately, at this moment, all the ship girls are aiming at this monster and unleashing their full firepower. Therefore, even though the North Sea Kraken zombie in front of her sensed the sudden deadly threat from Odin and made some movements, all attempts to strike first were directly beaten back by the ship girls' attacks. I have countless names, just as the wind has countless titles, and death has countless ways. I am Odin. As the last word fell, Odin raised the spear in her hand and faced the behemoth in front of her. Compared to this monster, which was like a small mountain, Odin's body seemed so small. But she still charged forward bravely, Just like she charged the British Royal Navy warships back then, blue-white lightning spewed out from the spear in her hand, and currents of electricity spread rapidly around like cracks on an ice surface. Odin vigorously waved the Gungnir in her hand, commanding all the lightning around and even in the sky to surge into the spear in her hand. A few seconds later, the spear in Odin's hand transformed into a spear composed purely of blue-white electric light, and then flew towards the head of the North Sea Kraken zombie like a shooting star. Screech, sensing the deadly threat, the North Sea Kraken zombie let out a sharp shriek, while releasing more highly corrosive dark green mist. But none of this could stop Gungnir, the ship-gear weapon that shared the name with the legendary artifact that was guaranteed to hit its target once thrown. A blue-white electric light instantly pierced through hundreds of meters of space, broke through all obstacles along the way, and deeply pierced into the emerald barrier inside the monster's head. Explode. Seeing Gungnir hit the target, Odin clenched her fist suddenly. In an instant, the spear, which had already transformed into solid lightning, exploded violently, turning the surroundings into an ocean of thunder. These high-voltage currents swept away the dark green mist and formed a wall of white water mist after hitting the sea, enveloping the entire monster. Unlike the dark green mist sprayed out by the monster just now, ordinary water mist could not hinder the ship girl's observation, so Enterprise quickly figured out the situation. Better than we thought. Not only has that annoying poisonous fog disappeared, but this strike has also severely damaged the hard barrier in the monster's head, Enterprise said, while sending several images to Hugo through the Admiral's network. From these images, Hugo saw that the emerald-like barrier not only had a penetrating wound where Gungnir had struck before, but also a large area around it had spider web-like cracks. Screech, the North Sea Kraken zombie shrieked again, but unlike before, this shriek contained great pain, and the magical infection ability made Hugo feel a tightness in his chest, almost causing him to spit out blood. Now, just as the monster shrieked, St. George, who had been standing on the side of the sea with both hands on her sword, suddenly shouted loudly, then raised her sword and jumped up. In an instant, a steed made of seawater appeared beneath her. After St. George mounted the horse, she forcefully waved her sword and pointed it at the North Sea Kraken zombie, then drove the steed towards the wound that Odin had just created. The North Sea Kraken zombie was desperately releasing large masses of green slime, trying to heal its wounds. As a modified undead creature, it exhibited vitality and sustained combat power that normal creatures could never possess. Seeing St. George rushing over alone, riding the wind and waves, the North Sea Kraken zombie desperately waved its tentacles, lashing at the surrounding air and sea, trying to stop St. George's charge. But St. George simply waved her sword lightly, and the shells and bombs fired by the other ship girls formed a long steel spear that charged towards the North Sea Kraken's wound. In an instant, these bombs and shells exploded on the tentacles that the North Sea Kraken was using to block, creating an opening that led directly to the Kraken's head before the slime secreted by the Kraken's body could repair the wound. St. George rushed through these wounds like a gust of wind. Even though repeated modifications had deprived the North Sea Kraken in front of her of most of the senses it possessed in life, some basic biological reactions still existed in this dead body. Realizing that this was another unstoppable blow, the North Sea Kraken immediately dived downwards, trying to use the seawater as a barrier to block St. George's attack. But no matter what actions the monster took, it did not affect St. George in the slightest. She just calmly held the sword in her hand and pointed it forward, letting the wind roll up her hair and brush past her calm face. For her, she only needed to know the Admiral's orders and where the enemy was, and everything else would not affect her in any way. There was no dazzling magical light, nor the environment that changed the color of the world like Odin just now, and not even a trace of holy light. St. George charged towards the behemoth in front of her like an ordinary cavalryman. But the next scene made everyone present widen their eyes, because the previously seemingly indestructible dark green barrier shattered into fragments in the sky, and then St. George rushed straight into the monster's huge head. In the next instant, a bright holy light burst out directly from St. George's body and pierced through the monster's body like a sharp sword. Unlike the usual gentle holy light, this time the holy light was extremely bright, even to the point of being dazzling, so much so that it seemed as if a sun had risen on the sea. Then, large masses of seawater surged out around the Kraken as the core, forming huge waves. The ship girls retreated one after another to avoid being swept into those waves. Alright, it's all over. Feeling the light outside slowly dimming, Hugo slowly lowered his hand that he had been using to block his eyes, only to hear St. George convey the information through the Admiral's network. This monster is dead, completely disappeared from this world, St. George slowly recited in a classical tone, as if reciting an ancient epic, and we have once again defeated evil, bringing long-lost light to this sea. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 190 Secret Base. Finally, it's a victory. Looking at the ship girls celebrating on the sea, Hugo breathed a long sigh of relief before coming here. He never imagined that the enemies he would encounter here would be so strong, that he would have to fight for a full 15 minutes, even with so many ship girls under his command. To solve the problem after a brief celebration, the ship girls quickly began to examine the monster's corpse. However, because the monster died suddenly, the wounds that had previously been blocked and glued together by the monster's dark green mucus all collapsed at once. So that the corpse fragments they finally found were less than 1/10 of the monster's previous living size. This monster was created with a huge investment based on the Kraken, and special adjustments were made specifically to counter various physical attacks. Indomitable, as a professional, carefully examined it and said, "Moreover, the entire thing was created no more than 50 years ago? Alright, Indomitable, I already know who made this thing." Before Indomitable could finish speaking, St. George used a stick to pry open a few pieces of rotten flesh, and then took out a fist-sized golden sphere from it. This golden sphere was inlaid with various gems that emitted magical power. At the same time, the magic array made of mithril on the golden sphere was still working, giving the entire sphere a disturbing aura of death. This aura of death was so strong that the high-quality gun barrel that St. George had just used to rummage through these things had become as rusty as if it had been soaked in seawater for a month after only a few seconds of contact. Fortunately, St. George directly covered her body with the power of holy light after realizing something was wrong, so she was now able to pick up the golden sphere as if she were holding an ordinary object. "Look here," St. George said, turning over one side of the golden sphere in her hand, and then pointing to an inscription on it, the symbol of the Deathly Hallows, which means that the person who killed and transformed the Kraken should be a Death Eater, and even Grindelwald himself may be the creator of this undead monster. Then the treasures here should be very precious. Warspite raised her hands in front of her chest and clenched her fists, while her eyes gleamed with excitement. Think about it, the treasures guarded by such a powerful monster must be very valuable. This thing shouldn't just be used to guard Grindelwald's treasures, Enterprise said after thinking seriously for a moment. If that were the case, this thing should have increased its defense against magical attacks to avoid attacks from enemy wizards, instead of having such a strong defense against physical attacks as it does now, as if it were targeting us. This may be a special weapon that Grindelwald prepared for his plan to rule Muggles, Hugo said, recalling the information he knew from both of his lives. Think about it, if such a monster appeared on any coastline, it would cause huge casualties and bring intense panic. Because ordinary people's armies would definitely not be able to stop it, wizards can't either. St. George shook her head and said, "This thing's inclination towards conventional physical defense doesn't mean that it's weak in magical defense. Even wizards can't do anything about this thing before they gather their forces. Therefore, for Grindelwald back then, he could completely command this monster to suddenly attack those coastal or even river cities, and then escape along the river or sea before the main force of the wizards arrived." After marveling at Grindelwald's plan back then, the ship girls began to scout the only uninvestigated volcanic crater on the island, as everyone had guessed. After the ship girls used radar to scout this dormant volcanic crater, they discovered a hidden cave covered by cooled lava. After easily opening the cave with the weapons in their hands, a smell of sulfur, accompanied by a large amount of high-temperature dust and water vapor, poured out of the cave. At first, everyone thought that it was caused by the explosion just now, but after waiting for a long time, Hugo and the ship girls unexpectedly discovered that these water vapors not only did not dissipate, but remained in that form. "This thing isn't a lava tube of the volcano, is it?" Hugo asked in a low voice. In his impression, after a volcanic eruption, a large number of spaces and tubes often appear inside the volcano. "No, this should be artificial." After losing 2 planes, Enterprise roughly figured out the situation in the cave. "After going 30 or 40 meters deep into the cave, I saw a lot of artificial traces. Since there were artificial traces, then this was very likely the place that Grindelwald left behind back then." So after a simple discussion, St. George and Indomitable, fully armed, walked in. After entering the cave, St. George and the others went down along the cave. And on the cave walls, they found a thick layer of salt crust. "It seems that there is a passage to the sea here," Indomitable's voice rang in the Admiral's network. "The temperature in the cave is very high, about 60 degrees Celsius. At the same time, a large amount of water vapor is generated because it is connected to the sea, and the salt on the surrounding stone walls should be condensed on the walls after the seawater evaporates, and this process may have taken a long time, so that it can form a salt crust about a palm thick. We found it, just as Indomitable was explaining science. St. George also found the target they were looking for. This target was located on the side of the cave wall, and was covered with a thick salt crust like other places, but obviously, these simple deceptions could not deceive the ship girls with radar and sonar. After directly smashing open the cave wall, Indomitable and St. George passed through this door located on the side of the cave. Then, the scene in front of them suddenly opened up because what appeared in front of the two ship girls was a huge underground space, which looked about 200 meters long, and about 20 meters wide and high. According to the size of this giant tunnel, it can be calculated that this wide tunnel directly enters below the sea surface, so the heat in the tunnel outside is naturally swept away by the coolness created by the cold seawater. Not far from the entrance of the cave, some silver threads were inlaid on the wall to form the symbol of the Deathly Hallows, and below the symbol, the Gothic German font read "For the Greater Good." It's really crazy. Even for wizards, looking at the sound and pictures transmitted synchronously through the Admiral's network, Hugo sighed in a low voice because most of this giant cave, except for a very small section at the entrance, was artificially excavated. Considering that this is a chaotic magic zone, this amount of engineering is definitely not small for wizards. What shocked him even more was that a 4 or 5 meter wide stone road stretched all the way from under St. George and the others' feet into the depths of the cave, and on both sides of the road, there was a green-brown street lamp full of green patina. Every 10 meters behind the street lamps are 2 or 3-story small buildings uniformly built of stone. Lines were also specially carved on the walls to make the whole house look no different from those brick houses outside, although the interior area of these rooms is slightly smaller than that of ordinary rooms because the walls and ceilings of these rooms are all built of whole stones. Other than that, they are not very different from similar buildings outside. Chapter 191 Search. Has Grindelwald gone mad? Unyielding looked at the huge cave in front of him, located below the sea around the volcanic island, with shock written all over her face. Why did that group of wizard supremacists build a town in this place back then? I'm not sure if that person is crazy or not, but I can confirm that this place has been operating for quite some time, St. George said, using the powerful searchlight on her ship gear to illuminate a wall of a house. Otherwise, they wouldn't be growing flowers here. Unyielding heard this and looked at the place St. George was illuminating, only to see a small raised flower bed on the stone wall, with some withered and blackened plant remains on top. What do you think those wizard supremacists used so much manpower and resources to build such a town here for? The mark at the entrance already clearly indicated the identity of the builders of this place, but Hugo, who saw everything simultaneously, simply couldn't imagine what the significance was of building such a complex structure in this place far from the mainland. There are many possibilities, Enterprise said from the side, although I firmly oppose Grindelwald's racist ideas. It is undeniable that he is a genius. And it is actually very difficult for us to guess what a genius wants to do. However, I think we will soon know what this place is for, because St. George and the other two have already begun further reconnaissance. Hearing Enterprise say this, Hugo immediately connected his consciousness to St. George's perspective through the Admiral network, only to see St. George and Unyielding choose a house by the road, open the door, and walk in. The doors here were made of steel plates, but they were not locked. With a creaking sound of the hinges that had not been maintained for a long time, the two ship girls saw everything in the room clearly. This room was very small, looking like a rectangular area of 3 meters x 4 meters. On the wall of the room, there was a bronze oil lamp and several cabinets against the wall. The farthest place from the room was a bed, and at the head of the bed was the only locked box in the room. This box looked like a 1x1x1 cube wooden box, and the box was inlaid with shiny, shallowly embossed brass sheets around it, a silver plate, a silver bowl, a set of silver cutlery. After gently twisting open the lock, Unyielding took out the various treasures previously hidden in the box with interest. Basically, they are all daily necessities, but there are also some things that can highlight the user's identity. After taking out a pile of things from the box and spreading them on the bed, the two began to count these things. For example, this silver cauldron shows that the owner here should be a potion maker. Unyielding pointed to the small silver pot the size of a soccer ball and said, "Because only professionals would use this expensive equipment, how do you know that this person didn't just have too much money to burn?" St. George asked, looking at the silver cauldron. "As far as I know, If the school rules didn't allow it, Slytherin's Malfoy would definitely buy a golden cauldron, because the various daily necessities we just found in this room are very simple. Unyielding pointed to the pile of sundries on the bed and said. So the only explanation is that the other party is a professional in this area, but why would someone with the talent to make potions suddenly hide in this kind of place like a groundhog? St. George asked with some confusion. Think about Snape's precious materials that could fill a room. Why would someone with this ability want to be on this desolate island in the North Sea? You're asking me, who am I going to ask? This is, after all, a relic from half a century ago. Unyielding shrugged her shoulders slightly unladylike. However, I think that if we can carefully inspect this place, we should be able to find the answer to the question. After making a decision, Unyielding and St. George followed the stone road in the center of the cave and inspected all the rooms on both sides of the road. During this process, several destroyer ship girls also took turns going down into the cave to help St. George and the others carry out the search work through the items found in the rooms. Hugo and the others confirmed that the rooms on both sides of the road were all residential areas. And among the people living there, in addition to some armed personnel, were all potion makers or alchemists. This is very likely Grindelwald's logistics base back then. Looking at the investigation conclusion, Hugo recalled the records about this period of history he had seen in the library. The Wizarding War that swept across the entire Western world lasted for decades, and naturally consumed a lot of items. Therefore, it is very reasonable for Grindelwald's side to have a secret logistics base. Just as Hugo was analyzing, St. George and the others also came to the end of this cave. What appeared in front of them were two piles of huge corpses dressed in armor, armed giants from Grindelwald's side. St. George said after looking at the badge on the armor. It looks like they should have died in their positions in an instant. It should be the effect of the killing curse. In the middle of these two giant corpses was a black anti-rust-treated bronze gate, and after pushing open the gate, what appeared in the ship girl's eyes was a circular hall with a diameter of more than 100 meters like the outside. The surrounding circle of the hall was also various buildings, except that the doors of the buildings were also marked with brown signs with names such as Department of Magical Law Enforcement, Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, and Muggle Control Department. What is this? An official magical institution belonging to Grindelwald. Warspite, who had just entered here, raised her eyebrows and said, looking at the words on these brown signs, it should be, and it also shows his ambition to control the entire world in his hands back then. St. George looked at these signs with a slightly disgusted expression. Don't forget, only the Ministry of Magic is called a department. These subordinate institutions are only divisions. Similar to the previous rooms, these rooms also maintain their previous operating state. And in these rooms, the ship girls found a large number of documents. These documents included the magical forces in various regions, the distribution of various magic-related minerals, and a large amount of information about certain wizards, etc. Although the passage of more than half a century has rendered many of the materials useless, the remaining materials are still very valuable to Hugo and the others. These materials alone are worth this trip. These materials are even more valuable than all the wealth of several pure-blood families combined, Warspite said to St. George next to her while stuffing these files into her ship gear space. After mastering these materials, we will have enough confidence to carry out the next step of expansion. St. George opened her mouth and was just about to say something when the Eskimo, who had been sent to the next room to inspect another room, suddenly screamed. What happened? Hearing the scream, the ship girls scattered in several rooms immediately put down their work and rushed to the room where the scream came from. Corpses, there are massive amounts of corpses here. The Eskimo, looking somewhat unsightly, pointed to the door in front of him and said, as soon as I opened the door, I saw at least 10 skeletal corpses in the room. Chapter 192 The Last Wooka. Ship girls are indeed pure warriors, but when they don't actively put themselves into a mechanized mindset, they often have personalities that match their appearance compared to the older sister personalities of those large battleship ship girls. The mindsets of destroyer ship girls are more like children, so they naturally cried out in surprise when they suddenly saw the skeletons. A dozen minutes later, Hugo, protected by several layers of protective magic cast by the ship girls, arrived in this room under Enterprise's protection. By this time, the skeletons that had been sitting around the table had been quickly wrapped up by the ship girls using canvas bags made from their enhanced snacks and placed on the ground. While other relics were placed on the table in the room. What exactly happened here just now? Hugo asked St. George, who had just finished a simple prayer and stood up. Also, what exactly did these people do? It was just that the Cossacks were startled when they first came in by the skeletons sitting in the chairs. St. George shook her head slightly and said, "As for these skeletons, they should be the elites of the Wizengamot party back then." Then, St. George sent Hugo the conclusion she had deduced from the things found here and the information everyone had discovered through the Admiral network. After carefully examining the things St. George sent him, Hugo quickly figured out what had happened here half a century ago. This place was one of the few most core bases of the Wizengamot party back then, providing a large amount of core equipment and supplies to the Wizengamot party during the war. After the failure of that crucial duel, the Wizengamot party, which still maintained its basic organization, quickly went underground and began preparing for its return in the future. As part of those preparations, this circular underground hall where Hugo and the others are now was built by these core exiles of the Wizengamot party at that time, because those Wizengamot party members believed that although they had temporarily failed, their leader Grindelwald would one day return like lightning, leading them to re-establish the Wizarding Golden Age promised to them. So, under this circumstance, they built a fictitious kingdom here. A kingdom, perhaps one that would never be realized, and fantasized about ruling this kingdom. This is why Hugo saw those signs on the doors of these rooms. However, in the end, these core Wizengamot party members gave up everything, because their plan to rescue Grindelwald failed. Although in a carefully planned attack, they successfully broke through the magical defenses around Nurmengard set up by various European ministries of magic and met Grindelwald. Grindelwald refused to leave with him. Not only that, Grindelwald even admitted his failure in front of them. And this approach completely struck a blow to those core members of the Wizengamot party. For this group of core members, Grindelwald himself and the path he pointed out were the only pillars in their spirits. And when Grindelwald personally admitted his failure, this pillar collapsed. So, after leaving Nurmengard, they came to the base in the Narvik Mountains of Norway with some kind of vengeful mentality, preparing to gather people again to attack Durmstrang. But just as they were planning, this exposed base was jointly attacked by the Swedish Ministry of Magic, the Finnish Ministry of Magic, and the Danish Ministry of Magic. It must be said that the remaining Wizengamot party members were also elites in spellcasting. Therefore, in cooperation with the troops originally stationed at this base and some scattered people who came, they caused huge losses to those attackers. But because the casualties in the process of attacking Nurmengard before were too heavy, this group of members still failed to resist those Aurors and Hot Wizards in the end. In the end, they had to withdraw from that base and flee separately. As for the box with a specific location of this area that Hugo and the others found before, it was used by the Wizengamot party for those secret intelligence personnel back then, in order to facilitate their emergency evacuation. Unfortunately, the secret intelligence personnel corresponding to this box exposed their identity in a conflict and died while resisting arrest, so this box was naturally forgotten everywhere. Finally, this group of core Wizengamot party members retreated to this base. After calming down, they quickly realized that their last hope had been shattered. Everything was over. In this despair, adhering to the idea of minimizing bloodshed for wizards as much as possible, most of the wizards who had worked here cleaned up their memories of this period with the Obliviate charm, and then randomly placed them in various places. Of course, as Wizengamot party members who were almost all stained with blood, they also did not forget to kill a few guys who had mastered too many secrets at the end, and then categorize and seal up all the treasures they had obtained before. The reason why this group of people sealed up those treasures is also very simple. Because they believed that this secret base could not be discovered by anyone in a short time. So, as magical supremacists, they hoped to preserve this precious magical knowledge and recirculate it in this world in an era when a certain wizard would gain world power in the future. According to their vision, this time should be 300 years after the undead creature made from the kraken outside had completely turned into a pile of rotten flesh. They believed that by that time, wizards who had developed to a new height would be able to break through the surrounding storms and come here, and obtain exquisite inheritance from them after making all the preparations. The only remaining people gathered in this room marked with the International Confederation of Wizards and committed suicide by taking poison, because for these people, after Grindelwald admitted his failure and refused to leave with them, their only spiritual pillar collapsed, becoming no different from walking corpses. Draft of Living Death. Just after Hugo finished browsing these records in the Admiral network, Indomitable also analyzed something from the dried residue in the silver cup on the table. These people are much more determined than we thought. This potion only needs one drop to kill hundreds of people, and it takes effect in less than a second. If they choose to drink this potion, they have no chance to regret it. Here, I have to say how much Voldemort failed as a person. Compared with the loyalty of the group of people under Grindelwald back then, Voldemort's subordinates can be regarded as a rabble, at least after Voldemort hung up for the first time. No one except Bellatrix was willing to take the initiative to find him, or to be precise, the people who were willing to fight to the death for Voldemort could probably be counted on one hand. After sighing for a while in front of these body bags about the difference between the two generations of Dark Lords, Hugo raised his head and asked Enterprise beside him. "By the way, I saw in the information that these people sealed up a lot of treasures. Have you found them now?" "Found them. Come with me." Enterprise nodded, then signaled Hugo to follow her towards the wall farthest from the door in this room. And there, Indomitable and Formidable were chiseling the wall with tools because, according to the information just obtained, these people hide all the wealth they possessed behind this stone wall before they died. Chapter 193 Hidden Treasure. This wall has a series of linked magical traps. If you don't open it using physical methods, it will trigger a series of explosions, and might even collapse the entire cave. Seeing Hugo approach, Indomitable turned her head and said to Hugo, "But we'll be able to open it soon, in about 5 or 6 minutes." It must be said that those last remnants of the Wizengamot put some thought into hiding things. For example, they hoped that some real large forces would come here, people who could truly understand the value of the wealth they left behind, rather than some tomb raiders. That's why the anti-theft design included a door that needed to be slowly opened using physical means, to ensure that those who came were indeed a team to achieve this. The Wizengamot group not only added a large number of trap-triggering systems to the wall and thickened it, but also added some special magical ingredients to the raw materials of the wall in addition to strengthening the hardness of this stone wall. The biggest feature of these ingredients is that they can shield various magical reconnaissance methods. Of course, nothing in the world is absolute. This kind of magical shielding naturally wouldn't have much effect when encountering a wizard of Dumbledore's level, holding the Elder Wand, but considering that this is a chaotic magic area, and that kind of powerful wizard generally wouldn't come here, the Wizengamot group naturally felt that this place was as indestructible as they imagined. However, this defense, which the Wizengamot group thought was indestructible, obviously didn't have much of an hindering effect on the ship girls. After all, the opponents the Wizengamot speculated about back then were only creatures of flesh and blood, and did not include existences like ship girls. It only took 5 minutes for 2 ship girls to easily create a large hole in the wall with ordinary tools, and they also destroyed those traps along the way. If it were ordinary people, it would take at least 10 people, and they would need enough tools to work for 2 or 3 days, Formidable said, looking at the large hole in the wall in front of her from the breach. Hugo and the others discovered that what was in front of them was a solid wall, about 2 meters wide, with many runestones originally used to activate magical traps and metal plates engraved with many runes embedded in the middle. Obviously, this was indeed a difficult defense to break through. If it were humans, wanting to dismantle this wall without triggering those traps would naturally require a lot of time to slowly chisel away. After shining the searchlight through the newly created hole, they saw a circular gold plate the size of a manhole cover at the deepest part of the cave, and on this gold plate, Grindelwald's Deathly Hallows symbol was also engraved in shallow relief, as well as the slogan proposed by Professor Dumbledore during his edgy youth walking into the cave along a road paved with a large number of gray square bricks. They found that the road was very narrow, at most only allowing 2 relatively thin people to pass shoulder to shoulder on both sides of the road. One huge shelf after another was filled with all kinds of things, with not even a little bit of space visible. Although the opening of this secret room this time was nearly half a century away from the last time, everything here was still the same as when it was sealed. All kinds of items were sorted into containers, and then placed in large boxes according to categories. On these boxes, gilded copper plates were used to write the lists of items inside, in addition to a few potions and magical items that could be preserved for a long time. Most of the items stored in the boxes were various alchemical materials that could be preserved for a long time. For example, like unicorn horns and longhorn dragon horns, which are almost priceless outside. There were more than 10 of each type here, and each one looked like a top-quality item that couldn't be bought on the market now. In addition, Hugo and the others also found many moving magical photos. Although, due to the passage of time, the magic on these photos had almost been lost, and they looked like they were about to become ordinary photos, but Hugo and the others could still tell from the photos that these should be some important events recording Grindelwald and his Wizengamot group at their peak. German Ministry of Magic, Austrian Ministry of Magic, Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. After opening a photo album, Enterprise quickly recognized the locations in the photos. Moreover, unlike ordinary landscape photos, in each of these photos, Grindelwald could be seen in the very center of the photo. with an attitude of pointing out a country and gesticulating, and in the most corner of the entire room were placed a whole row of huge silver-plated copper cabinets. After unlocking the magic locks on them and opening the doors, a large pile of books appeared in front of them. These books looked like they came from very diverse sources, because in addition to the parchment books common in the wizarding world, Hugo and the others also found bamboo slips from the East, clay tablets from the Middle East, papyrus scrolls from Egypt, and other products from all over the world. 14th century manuscript of the Emerald Tablet, possibly the earliest record in existence. And this roll of silk could very well be the earliest batch of Baopuzi manuscripts. It's unbelievable. How did the Wizengamot gather so many treasures together back then? From the beginning of checking the things in the cabinets, shipgirls inclined to the occult like Indomitable, St. George, Formidable, Illustrious, and Salem, whether they were here in person or watching the live broadcast on the Admiral Network, never stopped exclaiming because the materials stored here were not only of high quality, but also of huge quantity. There were even some classics that were legendary existences for the wizarding world. If there was anything that was not very satisfactory, it was that these books mainly focused on potion making and alchemy. And apart from that, the quantity of other materials was very small, and the quality was also very average. It seems that when Grindelwald dominated the entire Europe, he and his subordinates also obtained massive resources from this land, Hugo said with some emotion as he watched the shipgirls all come over to scan the contents of these books into the Admiral Network. That's right, compared to accumulating wealth bit by bit, war is the fastest way to obtain wealth, Enterprise said while scanning a clay tablet, but this is definitely not the right way to accumulate wealth, because in war, for every resource you obtain, at least 3 resources will be completely destroyed in the flames of war. You're right. So I will definitely not actively attack others for the sake of plunder. Hugo heard the content implied in Enterprise's words, and then assured her, of course, this prohibition does not include collecting spoils of war after defending against an attack, or excavating relics like today. After everyone cleaned up most of the books, Formidable discovered that the back panel of one of the bookshelves seemed to be movable. So after recording and packaging all the materials, they carefully opened the back panel of the bookshelf. This may be the most precious treasure in the entire warehouse, Hugo whispered with emotion, looking at the miniature interlayer hidden behind the cover, which was not much bigger than a laptop because now there were 3 flat gold boxes in this interlayer, each box inlaid with all kinds of gems. They looked far more gorgeous than all the other existences in the room. Chapter 194 Untie the Knot. Because the 3 boxes found in the hidden compartment of the large cabinet seemed extremely important, Hugo and the others first stored them in St. George's ship equipment space, planning to deal with them last after everything else was settled. Since only a small portion of the books remained, most of the shipgirls, except for a few who stayed behind to continue scanning the contents of the books, began to clean up the various supplies on the shelves for the shipgirls. The difficulty of transporting and taking these things away was obviously not significant, as they could simply use their ship equipment space to stuff them in. It was during this cleaning process that Hugo and the others discovered that what they had previously seen on the floor, thinking they were floor tiles, were not bricks or stones, but several layers of metal ingots. According to statistics, these metal ingots were mainly high-grade magic metals that were difficult to buy on the market, such as mithril and orichalcum. However, the largest quantity was a type of man-made metal, fairy silver. Where did this fairy silver come from? Cossack asked while grabbing metal blocks from the floor and stuffing them into her ship equipment space. Didn't they say that the fairies guarded this stuff very closely and basically didn't sell it? I don't know, there's no record of it here at all, Warspite, who had been responsible for checking the surrounding situation, said. But considering Grindelwald's sweep across Europe back then, it's not strange to be able to obtain this wealth. Amidst such conversations, the various treasures in the vault were being sorted, marked, inventoried, and then loaded into their respective ship equipment spaces at a speed visible to the naked eye. Since the shipgirls were all quite efficient, everyone quickly sorted out almost all the treasures in the vault while a few shipgirls were conducting a final inspection and handling of the 3 gold boxes from earlier. Hugo used the Admiral Network to consult Enterprise about a question he had been holding back for a while. There's a question that might involve intimacy. Hugo carefully sensed Enterprise's emotions through the Admiral Network while carefully choosing his words. Of course, I authorize you on this question, and you can choose not to answer if you don't want to, which doesn't violate the contract between Admiral and Shipgirl. Alright, my dear Admiral. Enterprise smiled helplessly at Hugo's appearance. I can feel that you don't have any malice, So I won't be angry no matter what question you ask. Okay, what I actually wanted to ask this time is, how do you really feel about me? Knowing that ship girls wouldn't lie to their admiral, Hugo asked the question directly after receiving her answer. You know, in my impression, admirals and ship girls are very close. But from the first time I met the ship girl Victory to now, I've come into contact with many ship girls. But the feeling you give me, at this point, Hugo became hesitant because even though he knew Enterprise wouldn't be angry, he didn't know how to express the following words in a suitable way. You mean why we don't seem as close to you as you imagined, and why we're so businesslike in our usual interactions, right? Because of the connection of the Admiral network and Hugo's expression, Enterprise quickly understood what Hugo wanted to say. Please rest assured, dear Admiral, our love and loyalty to you are unwavering. And you don't need to question or worry about that, and since coming into this world, we have also felt your heart and can confirm that you are the Admiral who best meets the requirements in our minds. As for why we seem a little cold to you and usually communicate in a business-like manner, the reason is simple. At this point, Enterprise smiled at Hugo, because you haven't made certain preparations yet. Preparations? What do you mean? After hearing Enterprise's words, Hugo felt even more confused. Does your emotions have something to do with my body? There's no mandatory connection, but there are some things we have to consider more. At this point, Enterprise paused. I don't think you've seen our true selves, have you? True selves? Hugo felt even more confused. Are you referring to a warship state like Belfast on the Thames? Of course not. Enterprise shook her head with a smile, and then said after thinking for a few seconds, in fact, as ship girls, we have obvious differences from ordinary people in appearance alone, so we have never revealed our formal appearance since coming into this world. In addition, we have also restrained our aura and fine-tuned the structure of our bodies. Because we usually have to imitate ordinary people as much as possible to avoid attracting unnecessary attention. Then what do you really look like? Hugo asked somewhat eagerly. He really couldn't understand why the ship girls had to hide their appearance from him. Well, it's like this. Enterprise contacted the other ship girls through the Admiral network for a few words, and then took Hugo to a corner and said, then closed her eyes in an instant. Enterprise emitted a non-glaring but very bright white light from all over her body. After the white light dissipated, Enterprise remained standing there in her original posture. At first glance, Hugo didn't see any difference between Enterprise and just now, but soon, he found that compared to the previous Enterprise, the current Enterprise was obviously more beautiful. If the original Enterprise was just a very beautiful girl, then the current Enterprise's level of beauty far exceeded the limits of humanity. With just small-scale adjustments to her body, her appearance rose to another level. More importantly, her unique temperament was also fully displayed at this time, making her feel more like an angel or an elf, rather than a human. Hugo felt his heartbeat faster and his face began to heat up. Just like we said, we are not flesh and blood creatures, but elves born from human imagination. Looking at Hugo, who had adjusted his state through deep breathing, a look of appreciation flashed in Enterprise's eyes. We are born from the most perfect imagination in human consciousness, so naturally we have appearances that surpass humans. Enterprise shrugged and then said, you should be controlling some of your thoughts now, right? Yes. Hugo grinned and showed an embarrassed smile. He felt that he didn't need to hide this from the ship girl. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. To be honest, I'd be worried if you didn't have these thoughts. Enterprise showed a knowing smile here. Think about it, my dear Admiral. You now have the mind of an adult and the body of a child, so in this case, we not only have to hide our true image at ordinary times, but also try to keep our distance from you as much as possible. Otherwise it will definitely have a bad impact on your development. Of course, if your body is strengthened to a certain level, these preparations will naturally not be needed. So Admiral, you must work hard and strive to become an ancient god admiral as soon as possible. Chapter 195 Treasure. After learning from Enterprise that the reason the ship girls were usually a bit cold towards him wasn't due to dissatisfaction, but out of concern for him, Hugo's mood improved a lot, and his heart was filled with fighting spirit at this moment. Indomitable and the others had completed all the processing work on the 3 gold boxes and were ready to open them. Then, Formidable was sent to find Hugo and Enterprise. After receiving Formidable's notification, Enterprise immediately returned to her original appearance, and then pulled Hugo to the side of the cabinet. Now there was a lot of space in front of the cabinet. The shelves that had been there were taken into the ship girl's rigging space, and the cleared space was occupied by a metal table with a magic circle drawn on it. The 3 metal boxes that everyone had found before were placed on the magic circle, and Indomitable took out one tool after another that others couldn't understand from her rigging space and placed them on the side of the magic circle. There is no magical reaction inside the box, and the conclusion after checking with the reconnaissance equipment attached to the ship equipment is the same. Indomitable explained to him after Hugo walked to the side of the table, "I think you should know that during archaeological excavations, some things that have been sealed for a long time are easily and quickly destroyed when they suddenly come into contact with oxygen, so to be on the safe side, I have made some preparations here." "Very good," Hugo nodded with satisfaction, and then carefully observed the expressions of the ship girls. Sure enough, the moment the ship girls saw him express his satisfaction, a happy expression quickly flashed across their faces. Of course, this action was completed in an instant. If Hugo hadn't been consciously paying attention, he wouldn't have even noticed that they had smiled. Obviously, just like Enterprise said before, Hugo has a very high status in the hearts of the ship girls, and his every move affects everyone's hearts. It's just that out of various considerations, everyone is now suppressing their emotions in front of Hugo. Just as Hugo was thinking about those things, Indomitable successfully opened the 3 gold boxes placed on the table. In an instant, 3 gold booklets that looked almost the same appeared in front of everyone. "It's a bit strange," Hugo muttered softly. "Grindelwald should have occupied a lot of resources back then, but why is there so little magic in these boxes that look so important?" "Because magic and magical materials have a shelf life." Indomitable quickly cleaned up the contents of these boxes while explaining to Hugo, "Sometimes, the most primitive methods can be preserved for the longest time." Soon, the gold booklets in the boxes were cleaned out. These gold booklets were all made of gold leaf. Each one was a rectangle 1 hand wide and 2 palms long, and all of them were covered with sunken letters. Each of these letters was only half a grain of rice in size, so that all the things that needed to be recorded could be recorded. After quickly reading a part, the ship girls immediately determined the content of these things. "The things here are really too precious. I think the wealth in this room is not comparable to the content above." It turned out that the 3 boxes recorded very precious information. The content recorded in the first box was the records of the flying broomstick manufacturing of Leonard Jukes and Gordy Brossaby, 2 flying broomstick manufacturing masters according to the professional Indomitable. These 2 were both geniuses in the manufacturing of flying broomsticks. Unfortunately, the magical theories, systems, and materials on the market at that time limited their level. "If we use the latest technology to complete these designs, what kind of broom can we make?" Hugo asked, looking at Indomitable. "If we simply integrate these theories and use the technology they didn't have back then to make up for various shortcomings, then we can mass-produce a racing broom with a top speed of about 120 miles per hour, and accelerate from 0 to 75 miles per hour in 10 seconds. After communicating with Salem on the west side of the Atlantic through the Admiral network, Indomitable quickly came up with a more specific plan. "You know, the brooms they designed back then, whether it was the Twigger 90 or the Silver Arrow, were very good racing brooms. They disappeared into history only because traditional workshop production could not meet the needs of the public, and not because there was a problem with the original design. So if we can use various new technologies in the past century to make up for those shortcomings, it will naturally be easy to manufacture a good broom." But this is only the level of sweeping 11 stars. Hugo was not satisfied with this answer. Considering that the fastest broom of these 2 masters back then was only 70 miles per hour, this is indeed very powerful. "But now, don't worry about this, my dear Admiral," Indomitable smiled and said. "What I just said is the finished product that can be made after simply integrating the notes left by the 2 masters without making any adjustments or upgrades. But if we can follow these technical routes to study and thoroughly understand the knowledge here, the final product will be a top-level sports broom with a top speed between 200 miles and 210 miles per hour, and an acceleration to about 160 miles per hour in 10 seconds. "That sounds great," Hugo nodded with satisfaction, because if he remembered correctly, the firebolt that would appear next year would basically be at this level. Therefore, if this enhanced version of the broom can be manufactured in a short period of time and launched on the market at about the same time as the firebolt, it will naturally be able to quickly seize a large market share. These materials will be sent to the United States, and then WASP in Massachusetts will specifically handle this matter," Indomitable said, "because everyone in Europe is too busy now, so we can't spare too many people to do this. More importantly, compared to the things in the other 2 boxes, these things that record the manufacturing methods of flying broomsticks can be said to be worthless. and I need to focus my energy on the other two things. What are in the other two boxes? Hugo asked with wide eyes. These flying broomstick manufacturing methods can be regarded as worth a lot of money, enough to support a profitable company at this time. Indomitable actually said that it was nothing compared to the other two things, which naturally aroused Hugo's curiosity all of a sudden. One of them is the notes of Thiago Quintana, a famous American wand maker. In addition to his records on how to make wands, there are also the most critical methods for obtaining and processing the spines of the White River monster in Arkansas. Indomitable paused here, and then said, and the last box is our biggest gain this time, about the manufacturing methods of goblin silver and goblin silverware. How is this possible? After hearing what Indomitable said about the contents of the other two items, Hugo suddenly showed an extremely shocked expression. If I remember correctly, the goblin silver technology and the galleon manufacturing technology should now be firmly in the hands of the goblins, and have never been leaked. Chapter 196 Fairy Silver. No one discussed the origin of Thiago Quintana's, the wand-making master's, notebook. After all, Grindelwald had been active in the Americas for a long time, so it wasn't too surprising to find such a treasure, but goblin silver was another matter entirely. This material, like the Wizarding World's currency minting technology, was one of the goblins' most closely guarded secrets, and its presence here was clearly abnormal. There's nothing strange about it, Enterprise said after a moment's thought. Grindelwald and the Purity Party were all staunch wizard supremacists. Do you think they would allow the goblins to keep such a valuable material for themselves? However, wizarding currency involved not only the goblins but also the entire magical world. So, Grindelwald probably didn't want financial problems to arise before he controlled the wizarding world, so he naturally didn't target the currency, but goblin silver is another matter. This material is not only versatile and expensive but also unique to the goblins. So, even if he targeted it, it wouldn't have a serious impact on wizards. Moreover, when we were researching information earlier, we found records of the Purity Party attacking goblin settlements, Enterprise said, and St. George immediately added. However, according to the records, the goblins didn't claim that anything was lost, so all of these incidents were classified as hate crimes. I can understand that, Hugo nodded after thinking for a moment. Because the goblins' core business now is Gringotts, and for the financial industry, security is paramount, so, even if something was really stolen from those goblins, they wouldn't say it. Otherwise, it might trigger serious concerns about Gringotts' security. Your analysis should be correct, my dear Admiral, Illustrious said, after a small group of blood-red energy bats circled around her. At least, according to the information I got from my sisters, last year, when that noseless guy took a tour of Gringotts, it triggered a small-scale bank run at Gringotts in Britain. If the news that Grindelwald's Purity Party had successfully robbed them back then were to spread, it might have a serious impact on the goblin-controlled financial system worldwide. You should know that in that era, wizard supremacists were clearly on the rise because of Grindelwald. If the goblins were caught in a loophole in this regard, it could indeed severely damage the financial industry they controlled, but we've never heard of this before. Hugo frowned. Grindelwald was a very clever man, and it seems abnormal to give up the opportunity to strike at the goblin forces at that time. I guess it must have been that the Purity Party exposed their identities when attacking goblin territory, so Grindelwald had to give up the opportunity after weighing the pros and cons. Enterprise analyzed simply. For Grindelwald, he was always trying to stand on the side of justice, or at least appear to be on the side of justice. For example, the Fiendfire attack at Père Lachaise Cemetery was like that. He let the civilians leave before launching the attack. So, for wizards, it was just a normal conflict. In that era, many wizards were attracted to Grindelwald's ideology and believed that he was a great wizard with his own ideas and representing the interests of most wizards, and directly robbing goblin settlements is too infamous. It's an act that completely breaks the rules. So, I think he gave up the plan to frame the goblins when everyone was likely to associate him with robbers. In other words, those goblins are much more powerful than we thought. Hugo's thoughts ran elsewhere at this moment. If I remember correctly, the Purity Party's individual combat level was equivalent to that of the Death Eater elites under that noseless guy. Being able to force the elites among them to expose their identities during an operation is enough to illustrate the goblins' power. Rowling is, after all, a writer, and her understanding of this world may not be very deep, Indomitable said with a playful smile while looking at information about goblin silver. In fact, goblin magic as a whole is not inferior to wizard magic, except that their respective focuses are different, and goblins are forbidden from using wands, at least, I can see from this document, which is called a technical document, but at least 80% of the content is a description of goblin magic. Their magic level is rough, but it's not without its merits. Is that all there is to their basic magic? Hugo stared wide-eyed at the not-so-thick golden booklet. In terms of quantity, there isn't much, because they only guide the magic power in their bodies through a method that they think will achieve the purpose they want to achieve, so it's enough to understand the most basic magic power guidance part. Speaking of this, Indomitable showed a depressed expression. This casting method is actually the same principle as when wizards occasionally experience magic surges when they haven't received any magical training, but perhaps due to racial differences, goblins can control their magic power, while humans basically can't. This is also an important reason why those goblins can monopolize these technologies. For wizards, this is an insurmountable technological gap. Hugo didn't find such a result strange. At least, from his own head of house, Professor Flitwick, he could see that goblins were very powerful in casting abilities, and this ability came from their racial talent. Although wizards possess powerful strength and rich knowledge and stand at the top of the magic world's pyramid in the competition of species, this doesn't mean that they are superior to other creatures in every aspect of magic. To give a simple example, a big reason why the various races that exist in the magical world today have survived to this day is that each of them possesses some talents that humans simply cannot master. For example, the giant's powerful strength and magic resistance, the goblin's various crafts, the Dirical's rapid spatial transfer, and even the phoenix's rebirth. In other words, this technology is of little use to us, right? After listening to Indomitable's words, Hugo looked at her and asked, "Wrong, on the contrary, only we can use this technology," Indomitable said, beaming, "because although we can cast spells like wizards in ordinary times, our instinctive way of casting spells is closer to the simple application of magic power like the gnomes, so as long as we open the ship equipment and enter combat mode, we can imitate the state of these goblins casting spells in ordinary times." Of course, here, imitation only refers to the directional imitation of the major aspect of casting methods. And if we want to completely imitate, we need to slowly try and explore. You don't need to rush on this point. Hugo shook his hand and said, "It's good to have hope. As for the matter of producing results, there's no need to rush too much. After all, we have a lot of things on hand right now and don't have much energy to deal with this aspect of things for the time being." If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 197, Ancient Runic. After thoroughly ransacking the entire treasure room, Hugo and the others began discussing the future arrangements for the island, considering that everyone who knew the details of this place before, except for Grindelwald himself, was dead, and Grindelwald wouldn't possibly reveal this matter to others. This island could be regarded as a very secretive location. "I think this place can serve as a temporary anchorage for us," Enterprise suggested her opinion. "At least when we need to go to the far sea to find something, having such an anchorage can be of great use." "That's right," St. George also chimed in to support. "More importantly, we don't need to worry about being discovered by others in this kind of place. So we can build a real port area." The real port area in the ship girls' minds isn't just a few small docks, it's a large-scale architectural system with logistics, maintenance, supply, and defense facilities according to the ship girls' standards. Such a port area should be able to independently resist the deep sea for 6 hours without the support of ship girls when facing ordinary deep-sea offensives, and if the deep-sea offensive is commanded by a boss-level deep-sea like Purple Cabbage, the port area must also withstand it for 30 minutes on its own. But this island is only the size of 4 football fields. Even if you hollow it out, I don't think it can provide much space, Hugo interjected immediately, hearing the ship girls discussing the construction of the port area. "That's enough, my dear Admiral," Odin, the expert in this area, said, leaning on a frame in his weakened state. "The port area you knew before was actually built when there was ample space, so we needed to consider the state of our warships, and naturally, the area was very large, similar to a real naval port, but in reality, we also have a type of port area that only accommodates shipgirl states, and the area of this place is just suitable for the construction of such a port area." Soon, the shipgirls began discussing the construction of the first fully functional port area in this world in the Admiral Network, and at the same time, They did not stop sorting out this underground base in just over 2 hours. They came up with a detailed document on the construction of the new port area and completed the cleanup of the entire port area. However, to Hugo's surprise, his system told him that he now had 3,200 galleons in wealth, so he could obtain a powerful skill. Why did I suddenly get more than 2,000 galleons? Hugo immediately called out Victory to inquire. Could this money be related to my treasure hunt in the space just now? Admiral, you're right. These should be your spoils of war. Victory, the size of a palm, suddenly appeared on Hugo's shoulder and said to him, because the aura buff you provided to everyone in this operation wasn't very important, only a small portion of the spoils of war belonging to you were recognized by the system. This amount is already a lot. Hugo was quite satisfied with this money. Think about the True Wizard Tournament, a life-risking competition that took a whole school year to get 1,000 galleons. It's obvious that I've made a lot of money by getting twice the spoils of war after only being busy for a few days. Hugo, what are you thinking about? In the cottage belonging to Mrs. Granger's father in Narvik, Hermione put the playing cards aside and looked at Hugo with concern. I feel like you've been a little abnormal these past few days. Although you look no different from usual, I always feel a little strange when you're doing things. This was already the second day after Hugo and the others returned from that island. The night before, Hugo took advantage of the fact that his family was still asleep and switched back his identity with Emden, who had been replacing him here before. I think it's because of the weather here, Hugo said, looking at the dim sky outside. It's not the same as Oslo in the south. There's only a short period of sunshine every day, so it might have affected me. How do you feel now? Is there anything uncomfortable? Hearing Hugo say this, Hermione immediately leaned over and asked with concern, Don't worry, sis. Hugo shook his head with an indifferent smile. It's just that the environment is too dark, so it makes people feel sleepy. I think I should recover after drinking a cup of tea later. It must be said that Hermione's observation is indeed amazing, especially after living with Hugo for more than 10 years. Any small changes in her twin brother can be quickly discovered. Therefore, even when Emden was imitating Hugo these past 2 days, even if the two could connect through the Admiral network, some subtle differences in some places still couldn't hide from Hermione. Fortunately, Emden could directly absorb the Polyjuice potion stuffed into the ship's equipment space, so he didn't induce suspicion because of the problem of having to replenish the Polyjuice potion every hour. However, even so, Hugo still needs to find a reasonable excuse to make an explanation for his abnormality in the past few days that at least sounds reasonable. Fortunately, the Narvik area has a polar night phenomenon in winter because it is very far north. So Hugo can use this excuse to brush off the problem, but also because of this reason, except for the first day they arrived here, carrying guns and wandering in the forest for more than an hour, and returning empty-handed. The arrangements for this period of time have mainly been skiing and practicing shooting at a shooting range. In addition to this, everyone spent most of their time reading books or playing some simple small games. According to Mr. Granger, it was feeling a kind of tranquility that was rarely felt before in this edge of civilization. To be honest, I didn't feel much of the tranquility that Dad said, Hermione said, after realizing that her brother was indeed okay. But I think this time is a good time to study. Okay, I understand. Hearing this, Hugo immediately understood what his sister wanted to do. So he put away the playing cards and took a book from his backpack to read. Just a few minutes later, taking advantage of the fact that his sister was already immersed in the ocean of knowledge, Hugo immediately shifted his attention from the book and transferred it to the knowledge in his mind. This knowledge is the knowledge about runes that Hugo spent 3,000 galleons to learn from Odin, and the reason why this knowledge is so expensive is because the rune knowledge in this inheritance is very comprehensive. You must know that the inheritance of runes in the wizarding world has almost been completely cut off now. Even the ancient runes taught in top magic schools like Hogwarts are only introducing the theoretical knowledge part and the content related to alchemy at most. However, in the inheritance that Hugo has now, various theoretical knowledge only accounts for a very small part, and most of the knowledge is about the practical application of various runes. Chapter 198 End of Vacation. As the core knowledge of the ancient Nordic Viking culture, the power contained in the runes is no less than the entire modern magic system. At least, in the few simple experiments Hugo conducted on that island after accepting the knowledge infusion, he discovered that runic magic was not much worse than common magic in terms of spellcasting effects. However, according to Odin, the biggest problem with runic magic is that it has very high requirements for the caster. On average, only 1 in 20 wizards possesses such talent. This is also why our runic magic is now completely lost. So, Hugo's so-called learning of this skill is not just about acquiring knowledge, but also a comprehensive improvement of his talent. And after possessing the corresponding talent, he immediately understood the various special aspects of this magic. For example, the spellcasting tools usable for runic magic range from knives, spears, swords, and halberds to stones, gems, or metal pieces, encompassing everything. As long as they are properly processed, they can be used as spellcasting tools compared to the modern magic's characteristic of using a single one for everything. This approach of using different spellcasting tools for different spells, although lacking in versatility, is, in some respects, more effective in terms of spellcasting. In addition, ancient runic magic releases magic power more directly, thus being able to unleash greater power in some combat-related spells. But with every advantage, there is a disadvantage. To perform precise manipulations with this magic, one must possess extremely high talent and practice repeatedly. Both are indispensable. This is also why our runic magic was eventually eliminated by history, because compared to modern magic, which is easy to learn and doesn't require high talent, the accessibility of runic magic was simply too poor. Fortunately, now that Hugo has exchanged for this skill, he has also gained top-tier talent in this area, so he can learn this complex magic like an ordinary person learning ordinary magic. In the following time in Norway, Hugo lived a pleasant and fulfilling life. In addition to thoroughly enjoying the beautiful scenery of this small Nordic country, he also completed his introduction to ancient runic magic. For magic with such a high learning curve, initiation can be said to be one of the most difficult hurdles encountered in learning this magic. And after initiation, he wouldn't encounter too many problems for a long time to come. Soon, Christmas arrived. Early that morning, Hugo, who had returned to his grandfather's house, was awakened by a chorus of unpleasant owl hoots. Opening the curtains, he saw a row of owls perched on the windowsill. Each owl clutched packages of various sizes in its claws. These gifts came from his friends, all sorts of interesting gadgets from the magical world. After briefly counting the gifts, Hugo was pleased to find that he had already sent gifts to these friends in advance. Who sent this? When Hugo arrived in the living room, he saw Hermione frowning as she held a strange-looking hairband. This hairband looked no different from an ordinary hairband, except that in the place where decorations should have been, there were two things that looked like small, orange-red carrots. My roommate Luna gave it to me as a Christmas present. If I didn't know she wasn't the kind of person with bad intentions, I would suspect she was mocking my front teeth for being like a rabbit's. Hermione said to Hugo, who had just come downstairs, I think those things on it aren't carrots, but dirigible plums. Luna's father's magazine, The Quibbler, introduced this plant. Hugo immediately guessed what Luna wanted to express. According to the introduction in that magazine, dirigible plums can improve the ability to accept unusual things. So, I think giving it to you might be because she thinks you are a friend worth making, so she wants to give you this thing to make up for the shortcomings she sees in you. Perhaps because of Hugo's intervention, Luna's school life was obviously much better than in the original story. Neither Hermione nor Venetia fully understood Luna's obviously different way of thinking, but they wouldn't engage in any school bullying because of it. Even with Hermione and Venetia's personalities, they would actively stop other students from bullying Luna when they saw something was wrong. So, Luna naturally had obvious goodwill towards her two senior classmates, so she sent each of them a Christmas gift. Unlike Hermione's hairband, Venetia, perhaps because she often drank coffee, received a jar of gourd roots from Luna that could be brewed into a beetroot-like pale purple liquid after spending a happy Christmas holiday with his grandparents. Hugo and his parents left Oslo on the second day of the new year and returned to England. Before leaving, because the original Christmas event did not occur, he gained 6 fate points, plus the 2 fate points he received every year. Hugo's fate points had returned to 11, so, before leaving, Hugo took advantage of the company's plane to cross several countries in one night, consuming 8 fate points to summon Vornamainen, Gustav V, Gotland, and the Lion of the North. As for not choosing to summon Tirpitz, the reason was simple. He felt that summoning her before summoning Bismarck, who could control Tirpitz, was not a good idea. Moreover, for Hugo now, the number of personnel was more important than quality. The current identities of the 4 Nordic ship girls are all indigenous Nordic wizards with a master-apprentice lineage because Durmstrang, located in Northern Europe, does not accept Muggle-born wizards, and because these northern regions retain more traditions than the core areas of mainland Europe, the identities of these 4 ship girls are naturally very easy to integrate into the current environment. With these 4 ship girls, Hugo could naturally project his power into Northern Europe, which was originally a power vacuum, as a place where various unique supernatural magical creatures survive and where ancient runic magic originated. Northern Europe is a very important region for the wizarding world, and extending his power to this region could gain him more power after once again entering the familiar family home. The fatigue of the journey allowed Hugo to rest well for an entire day. And during the last few days of the holiday, they stayed at home and busied themselves with their own affairs. Soon, the holiday ended. Hugo and Hermione once again boarded the Hogwarts Express and returned to school. Hugo was still very happy to be able to return to school, but hidden beneath his happiness was a certain anxiety, because until now, they had not been able to confirm who was holding Voldemort's Horcrux diary. According to the company's report, Hogwarts Castle was very quiet throughout the holiday, and no accidents occurred. But one not-so-good result was that because there were so few people staying at school, the number of suspicious candidates that could be eliminated this time was only in the single digits. It seems that I need to spend more effort on this in the second half of the school year, Hugo thought after reading the company's report. At least, I have to find a way to catch the guy holding Voldemort's diary before the worst-case scenario happens. Chapter 199 New Knowledge. Although a holiday had passed, the castle, with its thousands of years of history, hadn't changed much. With the return of the young wizards and the resumption of normal teaching duties, the entire castle became lively once again due to the continuous attacks before. Few people stayed at the school during this holiday. After leaving the school and spending a pleasant Christmas, most students' fear of the Chamber of Secrets had diminished considerably. The most obvious example was Neville, who had returned to his original clean appearance, unlike the previous period when he wore at least a pound of charms. However, Hugo didn't seem very relaxed, because his search for the suspected attacker had now reached a stalemate. Apart from confirming that the person was definitely not among the Ravenclaw and Gryffindor students, nothing else could be determined for Hugo. Voldemort, who had been resurrected halfway and whose situation he was completely unaware of, was actually very dangerous, because he could rush out from anywhere and launch an attack at any time. Although the Enterprise had set up necessary alarm facilities in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, Hugo and the others didn't think this could completely prevent attacks. At least the snakeskin left in the pipes could explain that the basilisk had been growing. Judging from the basilisk's size, to reach this point, the creature couldn't survive on just eating mice. Therefore, according to the ship girl's judgment, in addition to the girls' bathroom, there were likely other exits in or around Hogwarts Castle for the basilisk to enter. An exit for hunting. As for the speculation that someone analyzed when reading the books in his previous life that Hogwarts house elves were feeding the basilisk, this guess had been completely rejected by everyone because the house elves were directly under Dumbledore, and Dumbledore would definitely not tolerate a creature like the basilisk, which could cause fatal harm to students staying in the school. Therefore, if the house elves really knew the secrets about the Chamber of Secrets, they would directly report it to Headmaster Dumbledore, instead of being at a loss like now. During the period after the end of the Christmas holiday, the attacker seemed to know that Hugo and the ship girls were fully detecting his whereabouts, so he directly went into hiding and did not launch a new round of attacks. Now, the sun began to shine weakly on Hogwarts again. In the castle, people's emotions became optimistic, especially after Madame Pomfrey learned that the mandrakes had begun to mature. As soon as their acne heals, they can be transplanted. Hugo and Hermione heard Madame Pomfrey happily reporting the news to the Enterprise one day when they routinely went to the Enterprise to study, while she was chatting with the Enterprise in the Enterprise's office. Then, before long, we can cut them off and boil them on the fire. This way, everyone who has been petrified will be able to recover. I think that should have been good news just now, Hugo said to the Enterprise with a smile after Madame Pomfrey left. Colin Creevey and Sir Nicholas might have seen the attacker, and after the petrification effect on them is lifted, there is a high probability that they will be able to tell us who attacked them. I'm not so optimistic, because there is still half a year before the mandrakes mature, the Enterprise said while motioning for the Granger siblings to sit down. And this time is enough for the attacker to launch multiple attacks. Then didn't they ask you to find a way to buy a petrification antidote? Hermione asked the Enterprise curiously. I remember you said you could buy it when Filch's cat was attacked. You're right, but the problem now is that the school board has been unwilling to approve the money, the Enterprise said, revealing some news she had recently obtained from conversations with the professors, especially Lucius Malfoy. He firmly believes that this extra-large expenditure may cause unnecessary attention to the school from the outside world, thereby affecting the school's reputation. But now there have been 4 victims in a row, Hermione said with a puzzled expression. Isn't this enough to illustrate the seriousness of the matter? Most of our school board members don't see it that way. The Enterprise showed a disdainful look. Whether it's your ginger cat or Filch's Mrs. Norris, they are just cats, and Nick is just a ghost, so if they are petrified, it won't attract too much attention. What about Colin Creevey, the Gryffindor first-year student? Hermione's expression turned to shock after hearing the Enterprise's words. This is a living student, isn't that important either? I'm sorry, for those school board members from pure-blood wizarding families, Muggle-born wizards like us are not much different from cats or ghosts. A hint of anger appeared on the Enterprise's face. At least the news she had received from other professors was not very pleasant. What? The Enterprise's answer sounded so incredible that Hermione had to ask the Enterprise again to confirm. That's right, in the eyes of many pure-blood wizarding families, we are actually completely different from them, and we are one level lower than them. The only gratifying thing is that at least none of the school's professors hold this view. After all, Hogwarts professors were personally hired by Headmaster Dumbledore, and for Professor Dumbledore, he would naturally avoid those extreme blood purists from entering the school and poisoning the students. This is really terrible. Hermione frowned. We are clearly all human beings, but why are there always some people who look down on another part of people for this or that reason? Okay, don't think about this problem now. The Enterprise gently patted Hermione's arm like a confidant and said, at least in my opinion, this is not something that students your age should be considering. Skipping over this unpleasant matter, the Enterprise then guided Hugo and Hermione in their training. And today's training content was related to ancient runes. I think you already have a basic understanding of how to use transfiguration in battle. The Enterprise looked at the Granger siblings with a serious expression. I am quite satisfied with your academic level during this time, and during my trip to Northern Europe during Christmas, I found some interesting knowledge. Considering your level, I think you should have enough level and will to learn this knowledge. Thank you so much, Professor Halsey. Hermione became excited after hearing what the Enterprise said. Because after spending a whole year in the wizarding world, she also knew how precious the knowledge of the wizarding world was, so when the Enterprise said that she wanted to impart some knowledge to herself and her brother, she immediately expressed her attitude. Don't thank me yet. I have to declare one thing in advance, that is, this knowledge has a certain degree of danger. If you don't have the corresponding level, self-study will only cause some serious, even fatal, threats. The Enterprise looked at the Granger siblings and said word by word. So in this case, I must enter into a magical contract with you to prevent you from intentionally or unintentionally leaking this knowledge into the hands of unsuitable people. Chapter 200 Temporary Calm. Please allow my brother and I a few minutes to discuss this. After hearing this, Hermione immediately excused herself to Enterprise, then pulled Hugo to the other side of the room to confer. After all, once magic contracts were involved, many things could be affected. So Hermione felt it necessary to discuss it with her brother. The result of the discussion was naturally to sign the contract and learn the magic, because through Hugo's persuasion, Hermione realized that Enterprise, whether it was her previous relationship with Hood, her career in the United States, or being hired by Professor Dumbledore to teach at the school, all indicated that she was a very reliable person from another perspective. Many magical knowledge areas are indeed fraught with danger, and without guidance, learners can easily go astray. Therefore, it was very reasonable for Enterprise to set conditions in this regard before imparting knowledge. After confirming that everything was normal, Hugo and his sister signed the magic contract with Enterprise. Then, Enterprise took out the ancient runes knowledge she had summarized from Odin and began teaching from the most basic level. Exchange good books. Follow the VX public account, Book Friends Base Camp. Follow now to receive cash red envelopes. I remember Hogwarts seems to offer ancient runes, which teaches these things. During a break, Hermione asked curiously. Then what's the difference between what you're teaching us and what's taught at school? This is the original version of ancient runes that we found during our adventures. Most importantly, it contains the magical usage of the runes, which has been partially lost in the current wizarding world. Speaking of this, Enterprise revealed a proud expression. So, what can be learned in the ancient runes class at school now is just some translation of ancient texts, and it's impossible to use these ancient runes for casting spells like true ancient wizards. Of course, this doesn't mean that this knowledge is completely lost now. For example, the alchemy class, which is still offered to older students at Hogwarts, teaches some magic in this area. What we are going to learn now is the role of these ancient runes in usual spellcasting. As far as I know, apart from Durmstrang, which still has some of this knowledge passed down, there is nothing else left in this area. In the first lesson, Enterprise only introduced the characteristics of these ancient runes magic to the Granger siblings and briefly introduced the meaning of each ancient rune symbol, but just finishing these simple things completely ended the few hours of teaching time, so Hermione could only reluctantly say goodbye to Enterprise, then left Enterprise's office with Hugo and returned to the Ravenclaw Tower. I really didn't expect that there is such magic in the world. On the way back to the dormitory, Hermione whispered to Hugo with emotion. But I hope that I can have the talent that Enterprise mentioned next, sis. I think you should be fine in this regard. Hugo turned to look at Hermione and said with a serious face. At least, according to the content in the original text, it can be analyzed that Hermione's magical talent definitely belongs to the top group. Unlike schools in the ordinary world, schools in the wizarding world not only teach some theoretical knowledge, but also require a lot of practical courses to be completed. Even from a certain point of view, practical courses are more important than theoretical courses in this case. Hermione being at the top of her class in every year's exams can only mean one thing. Although she was not born into a wizarding family, her talent is stronger than that of most wizarding families. This is not a strange phenomenon. At least in the Middle Ages, the wizarding world often believed that Muggle-born wizards had an advantage in talent. But as history progressed, this statement gradually disappeared for some promotional considerations. However, according to the conclusions Hugo and the shipgirls have compiled, at least in Hogwarts, pure-blood families account for the majority of those at the bottom of the spellcasting talent ranking. For example, Slytherin's Crabbe and Goyle are like this. That's right, my spellcasting talent will definitely not be worse than other wizards. After hearing what her brother said, Hermione relaxed a lot. So I will definitely be able to learn this magic. Time passed quickly for a month, and the atmosphere in the school seemed to suddenly return to its usual calm. Although the culprit of the previous attacks had not been caught, everyone seemed to think that the attacker should be scared and would not launch any more attacks. The problem is, not everyone thinks so. For example, Hufflepuff's Ernie insisted that the attacks would not stop until Harry was caught. And Peeves, who especially likes to cause trouble, would not give up any opportunity to sing his song "No, Potter, you horrible boy," when appearing above the crowd when there were many people. Seriously, Harry. You really don't need to pay too much attention to other people's opinions of you. Hugo looked at Harry and Ron, who were sitting across from him, with some helplessness. Perhaps because these recent events made Harry feel a little upset, he would always hide in the library to read whenever he was free. And as his best buddy, Ron was naturally pulled over as well, perhaps because Hugo and Hermione had expressed their firm belief that Harry was not the so-called heir of Slytherin. Harry would sit next to Hugo and Hermione whenever he was in the library, but in this way, the Granger siblings could not read their ancient runes books in the library, which is why Hugo persuaded Harry to leave. I don't want to be like this either. After looking around and not seeing Mrs. Pants, Harry lowered his voice and said to Hugo, "But too many people are pointing fingers at me, and this feeling is very uncomfortable. Besides, Lockhart will take every opportunity to talk to me at length about a bunch of boring content about how to be a celebrity, like a mosquito buzzing in my ear, which is just too annoying." Obviously, Lockhart's annoyance is not only reflected in harassing Harry, the celebrity. For example, Firefly once told Hugo that she saw Lockhart bragging to Professor McGonagall that the castle had been peaceful recently because of his credit. He even thinks that the school should boost morale. "Eliminate the things from last semester in the memory," Firefly said in a slightly exaggerated tone. We all know what he ended up doing, but to be honest, compared to the brain-dead behavior in the original text, it should be more terrifying if you were serious. Enterprise joined the Admiral network at this time. Don't forget what he is good at. I believe that if he really wants to erase the things from last semester in the students' memories, it is not impossible to do it. Okay. I suddenly think Lockhart's liking to mess around is also an advantage. After hearing the hidden meaning in Enterprise's words, Hugo shuddered. At least this kind of messing around won't cause any fatal danger. When eating breakfast on February 14th, Hugo walked into the Great Hall out of curiosity. After all, this part was only described in the novel in his previous life, and the movie did not shoot this part. So he wanted to see what the specific situation was, but what Hugo didn't expect was that even though he had made enough mental preparations, everything in the Great Hall still shocked him. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.